They called her the Mop Nurse, the one who restocked shelves, cleaned spill trays, and smiled when she was talked over in rounds. For 8 months at Crestfall Memorial Hospital, Dr. Marcus Hale had treated Leah Donovan like furniture. Something you moved around when it was inconvenient, something you never actually looked at. He was the chief trauma surgeon. She was nobody, except she wasn't. And the night a black military helicopter tore through the storm above Crestfall, everything Marcus Hale had built, the reputation, the power, the carefully buried lies, was about to be pulled apart by the woman he'd worked hardest to destroy. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the stories on this channel do not hold back. Every week we bring you narratives that will have you on the edge of your seat and you will not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The supply closet on the 3rd floor of Crestfall Memorial Hospital smelled like antiseptic and old cardboard, and Leah Donovan had memorized every shelf. She knew which row had the IV lines, which cabinet held the backup pressure cuffs, and which corner of the top shelf had been shoved full of expired saline bags that nobody had bothered to dispose of because that was her job too, apparently. She'd asked the charge nurse about it twice. Both times the answer was a vague gesture and a "just handle it when you have a free moment," which at Crestfall was code for never, because Leah never had a free moment. She worked 12-hour shifts that regularly became 14. She picked up the floats when the agency nurses called out sick. She translated for the Haitian family in Bay 7 who spoke only Creole because she'd spent 2 years abroad and nobody else on the floor could manage a single sentence, and she did it without being asked and without being thanked. She handled the combative patients, the complicated discharges, the family members who screamed at the nursing station because they'd been waiting 3 hours for a pain update. She handled all of it because she was a nurse, and that's what nurses did. What she was not supposed to do, according to the unspoken hierarchy of Crestfall Memorial's emergency department, was have an opinion. That rule had been made clear on her 2nd week. She'd been at the whiteboard updating patient statuses when Dr. Marcus Hale walked into the bay with his team, 4 residents orbiting him like anxious satellites, and began rattling off orders for the patient in bed 4, an older man named Earl Briggs, who'd been brought in with chest pain and had been waiting 40 minutes for someone to actually examine him. Leah had looked at the orders, then she'd looked at the chart she'd already pulled. Then she'd said quietly, "His troponin came back elevated. I flagged it for the attending 20 minutes ago. He might want a cardiology consult before we push the nitroglycerin." Dr. Hale had turned and looked at her the way you look at a fire alarm that's going off for no apparent reason, mildly irritated, not particularly concerned, already dismissing it. "I'm sorry," he said. "And you are?" She was the nurse who'd been on this unit for 6 weeks at that point. She was the nurse who had introduced herself to him twice in the break room. She was the nurse who had handed him a patient chart during a trauma call 3 days prior while he was elbow deep in someone's chest. None of that had registered. "Leah Donovan," she said. "I've been on this unit since January." "Right." He turned back to his residents. "Push the nitro. Get cardiology on the phone after the fact if the EKG changes." The cardiology consult would have been the right call. She knew it. She also knew she didn't have the rank to push back. Not in that room. Not with those 4 residents watching her and waiting to take their cues from the man who signed their evaluations. She updated the chart and said nothing. Earl Briggs spent the next 6 hours in the ICU after his pressure dropped. He made it through. Marcus Hale never mentioned the troponin flag. That was 8 months ago. In those 8 months, Leah had developed a finely tuned skill she privately called managing the temperature of the room. She knew when Dr. Hale was in a bad mood because his voice went half a register lower, and he stopped making eye contact with anyone who wasn't a physician. She knew when one of the senior nurses was covering for a mistake because they'd pull her aside and ask her to leave that part off the incident report. Nothing really happened. She knew which residents were being trained properly and which ones were being handed shortcuts because Dr. Hale preferred the faster version, the one that looked cleaner on paper. She also knew that 3 patients in the past 4 months had experienced complications that should have triggered mandatory reporting under the hospital's internal protocol and that those reports had never been filed. She'd found the first one by accident. It was a post-surgical case from November, a woman named Terry Ash, who'd come through the ER after a fall and ended up in an emergency abdominal repair. The procedure had complications, significant ones. There'd been a secondary bleed, a delayed response in the OR, and a recovery period that stretched 2 weeks beyond what was projected. Leah had cared for Terry during those weeks. She'd read every note. She'd also pulled the original surgical report when she was cross-checking medication reconciliation, and she noticed something she couldn't quite make fit. The post-op notes referenced a complication that the original operative report didn't document. That wasn't unusual on its own. Sometimes things got added later. Sometimes the timeline of dictation ran behind. But when she went back to compare the timestamps on the documents, the original report and the amended one, they didn't match. The amendment was dated 3 days after the patient had already been discharged. 3 days after Terry Ashe had gone home and signed her discharge papers and was no longer in the building to ask questions. Leah had sat with that for a week. She'd gone back twice to look at the files again. She'd checked 2 other recent cases with similar timelines, cases that had gone through Dr. Hale's service, cases that had involved complications. And in both of them, she found the same pattern. Documents that didn't align, timestamps that didn't hold, amendments made quietly after patients were gone. She wasn't certain. She hadn't run it by anyone. She was a bedside nurse, not an auditor, and the system wasn't designed for nurses to go pulling surgical reports unless they had a documented clinical reason. But she kept looking quietly, carefully, in the margins of her shifts, because something was wrong and she couldn't let it go. She hadn't said anything to Dr. Hale, not after Earl Briggs. The morning she decided she had to say something to someone, not loudly, not aggressively, just to put it on record. She was pulling a double and hadn't slept more than 4 hours. She chose her moment badly. She found Dr. Hale at the physician workstation during a brief lull between trauma cases, and she asked if she could talk to him privately for a few minutes. He looked up from his screen. He had the kind of face that medical schools didn't teach, but hospital politics manufactured. Polished, pleasant, and entirely unreadable. "Sure," he said, which surprised her. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "What's on your mind, Donovan?" She kept it factual. She didn't use words like fraud or misconduct. She laid out what she'd noticed, the timing inconsistencies in 2 post-operative reports from cases on his service, the amended documentation appearing after patient discharges, the November case where the operative note didn't reflect what the post-op nursing record documented. She watched his face the whole time. He didn't get angry. He didn't look rattled. He listened to the entire thing with a kind of patient attentiveness that felt more like strategy than openness. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're pulling surgical reports?" "I came across them during medication reconciliation. It wasn't intentional at first." "At first," he repeated. "I wanted to make sure I was seeing it correctly before I said anything to anyone." He nodded slowly. He picked up his pen, clicked it twice, set it down. "I appreciate you coming to me directly," he said. "That shows good judgment. I'll look into it." He paused. "But I'd encourage you to be careful about the conclusions you're drawing from documentation. You may not have the full context to interpret. Surgical records are complex. There are legitimate reasons for amendments you might not be aware of." She said, "I understand that. I just wanted to flag it." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You should worry less about hospital records," he said, "and more about keeping your job." He said it pleasantly, like it was advice. She walked back to the nursing station and updated her patient assignment board and did not let her hands shake until she was in the break room with the door closed. 3 days later, the charge nurse called her name before she'd even gotten her badge scanned. "Leah, conference room. Dr. Hale and hospital administration need to see you." The conference room had a glass wall facing the nurse's station, so everyone on the floor could see her sitting across from Dr. Hale and the HR director and a woman from the compliance office who had a tablet and wasn't making eye contact. They told her that a review of a patient medication order from 2 nights prior had identified what appeared to be an approval error, a dosage that fell outside safe parameters for the patient's weight and documented allergies. They told her the digital record showed her credentials were used to approve the order. They told her she was suspended pending investigation. She heard all of it and felt the specific cold clarity that comes right before something very bad, the moment when you understand that the situation is worse than you realized and you're already inside it. Dr. Hale sat to the side, slightly removed from the other 2, which was a choice. It let him look like a bystander rather than a participant. He had his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something that managed to look like genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Leah," he said. "I know this is hard, but patient safety has to come first." She looked at him. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked down at the table. She handed over her badge to the HR director and stood up and walked out of the conference room and kept walking until she reached the stairwell at the end of the hall. And she stood there with her back against the wall and ran through everything she knew. Her credentials, the digital approval. The timestamp would show when the order was entered. She hadn't approved any out-of-range medication order in the last 48 hours. She would have known. She was meticulous. She triple-checked anything that flagged in the system, which meant someone else had entered it using her login. She thought about the conversation in the workstation 3 days ago. The way he'd paused before answering, the way he'd looked at her badge. Then she thought about something else, something small that she'd noticed on her way out of the conference room. The timestamp on the document they'd shown her during the meeting. It had been displayed briefly on the compliance officer's tablet before the screen was angled away. Just a second, just enough. The timestamp on the medication approval was 11:47 p.m. Leah had left the building at 10:15 p.m. that night. Her badge scan at the parking exit would show that. The security camera at the staff exit would show that. Someone had entered that order more than 90 minutes after she left the building. She stood in the stairwell and understood exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not panic. It was something harder than panic, something quieter. She pushed off the wall and took the stairs down to the ground floor. The parking lot was gray and cold, the kind of afternoon that hadn't decided whether it was going to rain. She sat in her car for a while, not driving anywhere, working through it methodically. She needed the exit timestamp from security. She needed whoever had pulled up the system using her credentials to have left a trace. They always did, if you knew where to look and had someone with access to the audit log. She needed the original medication record from that night, not the version they'd shown her on a tablet, but the actual system entry with the full metadata trail. She also knew she couldn't get any of that from outside the building as a suspended employee. What she could do was start building what she had. The amended surgical reports. The November case. The 2 subsequent ones. She'd taken photos of 3 pages with her phone, not systematically, not with a plan, just because she'd had a feeling she couldn't articulate at the time that she might need something to point to. She hadn't thought it would be this soon. She was thinking through who she could call. The state nursing board, the hospital's patient safety officer, though that person reported to the board, and the board liked Dr. Hale, an attorney if it came to it, when her phone rang. It was her friend Dana, who worked the night shift in the ED and had been on when the medication incident supposedly occurred. "I just heard," Dana said. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay. I need to ask you something. Night before last, do you remember who was logged into the physician workstation around 11:30? A pause. "I was at triage most of that night. Why?" "The order they flagged was entered at 11:47. I left at 10:15. Another pause, longer. "Leah, I know. You need to be careful. I'm being careful. Do you know if the workstation camera footage is kept or if it gets cycled? It gets cycled every 72 hours unless there's an active incident flag on it." She checked the date. It had been 41 hours since the supposed incident. She had a window. "I need that footage flagged before it cycles," she said. "I can't do that. I can't put myself in the middle of this." "I'm not asking you to. I'm just telling you what I need." "Leah, I found altered records, Dana. 3 cases. He amended surgical documentation after patients were discharged. That's what this is about. He's trying to bury me before I can put it in front of anyone." The line was quiet for a long time. "I'll see what I can do," Dana said, finally. What? That night, Leah spread everything she had across the kitchen table. Phone photographs of 3 report pages. Her own notes, written in the margins of a small notebook over the last 6 weeks. Dates, discrepancies, case numbers she'd memorized rather than written directly in the system. The timeline of the Terry Ash case laid out in a sequence that she'd gone over so many times she could recite it. She was still sitting there at midnight when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Major. That was all it said. She stared at it. Nobody had called her that in 4 years. Not since she'd separated from active duty and taken her discharge papers and told herself that part of her life was finished, that she was going to do something different, something that felt like stillness instead of forward motion at all costs. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 30 seconds. "Captain Voss, 3rd Medical Support. We have a situation. I need to know if you're available." Her chest did something complicated. She typed, "I'm not active. We know. This is not a standard mobilization request. We have a critical asset coming in. He's been asking for you specifically. We're 6 hours out." She looked at her kitchen table, at the notes and the photographs and the little notebook, at the suspension letter they'd handed her when she turned in her badge, which was sitting on top of everything like a lid. She typed, "What's the asset? Commander Rafe Drummond. 3rd Special Operations. He knows you from Kandahar. He doesn't trust anyone else to run his trauma stabilization." She set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Rafe Drummond. She'd pulled him back from the edge of dead in a forward operating base in the middle of a dust storm with 1 unit of blood and a prayer that she'd told herself was not a prayer because she didn't do those anymore. He'd called her the most dangerous nurse he'd ever met, which from Drummond was a significant compliment. She picked the phone back up. "What's the injury profile?" "Blast exposure. Penetrating abdominal. Secondary TBI, we think. He's been in the field for 71 hours. The asset is fragile and the politics around him are significant. What hospital are you routing to?" There was a pause that was just a little too long. "Crestfall Memorial. It's the only level 1 trauma in range." She sat very still. Then she typed, "I'll be there." She didn't sleep. She spent the next 3 hours going back through everything she had, organizing it differently now. Not as a personal defense, but as something that needed to be ready for someone else to look at. Someone with authority. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Dr. Marcus Hale's reputation or the hospital board's investment in his continued employment. She had been trying to figure out how to get her documentation in front of someone who couldn't be managed or outflanked. She hadn't expected the answer to come from the sky. At 4:47 in the morning, she heard it before she saw it. The deep mechanical thrum of rotor blades cutting through the low cloud cover above the city of Meridian. Not a news helicopter, not a commercial aircraft. She'd spent enough time in places where that sound meant something specific to know the difference immediately. She was already pulling on her jacket when her phone buzzed again. 20 minutes out. "We're bringing something else, Major. Something we found in transit that you're going to want to see. Don't go anywhere near that building until we land." She stopped with one arm in her jacket sleeve. "What did you find?" The response was a single photograph. Small, partially blurred, clearly taken from a screen rather than printed. But she could read it. She could read the header and the case number and the date and the name at the bottom of the document. The name was Marcus Hale. The document was a military medical services contract from 8 years ago, a consulting arrangement between Dr. Hale and a defense medical contractor that had been flagged by the Inspector General's office for irregularities and quietly closed without resolution. She stood in her kitchen with one arm in her jacket sleeve and the other holding her phone and understood that what was about to happen at Crestfall Memorial was not just about her. It was about all of it. The helicopter was somewhere above the clouds, getting closer, carrying a man she'd once kept alive with her hands and her training and everything she refused to let go of, even when the world told her it was over. She finished putting her jacket on and picked up her notebook and walked out the door into the dark. The street outside her building was empty in the way that streets only get at 5 in the morning. Not peaceful, just abandoned, every light a little too yellow, every shadow running a little too long against the wet pavement. Leah walked to her car with the notebook under her arm and the photograph still open on her phone, and she looked at it one more time before she started the engine. The document header was partially cut off, but the contract date was legible. 7 years ago, when Marcus Hale would have been in his second year at Crestfall, still building the reputation that was now so solid it functioned like a wall around him. The defense contractor's name was partly visible, something with medical in the title, the rest obscured by the angle of whoever had photographed the screen. And at the bottom, under a signature block, the name Marcus Hale in printed letters, followed by a title she hadn't expected: Clinical Consultant, Medical Assessment Division. She didn't know yet what that meant in full. She knew it meant something. She knew the kind of contract that got flagged by an Inspector General's office and then quietly closed without resolution didn't get that way by accident. Something had been buried, and whatever had been buried had apparently left a trail that someone in a military helicopter was now carrying toward Crestfall Memorial at just under 5 in the morning. She started the car and pulled out of the lot. The drive was 12 minutes without traffic. She made it in 9 and parked 2 blocks from the hospital on a side street that faced the east parking structure, where she had a clear sight line to the helipad on the roof of the trauma tower. She killed her headlights and sat in the dark with the engine running for heat and thought about what Captain Voss had said. "Don't go anywhere near that building until we land." She understood why. If she walked into Crestfall right now, suspended badge or not, someone would call security and she'd be removed before anything could happen. She needed the military unit inside the building first. She needed Drummond through the trauma bay doors, and the situation locked in before she showed up, because the moment she appeared, Hale would try to control the narrative, and she needed the narrative already out of his reach. So she waited. The helipad lights came on at 5:14 a.m., the red and white perimeter markers that they activated for incoming aircraft. She watched them from 2 blocks away, a small grid of light on the roof of the trauma tower, and she felt the vibration before she heard the sound properly, that low frequency that you felt in your back teeth before your ears caught up with it. The helicopter came in from the northwest, moving fast and low under the cloud ceiling, military configuration, no commercial markings. It hit the pad hard, not a rough landing exactly, but urgent, the way aircraft landed when the people inside were working against a clock. The rotor wash sent a ripple across the puddles in the parking structure below. She got out of her car. She went in through the loading dock at the back of the building, using the staff access code she still had memorized from the trauma supply runs she'd done for 8 months. The code hadn't been changed yet. Suspension didn't trigger an immediate lockout on the loading dock keypad. That was a manual process that required someone in facilities to run it, and at 5 in the morning, nobody had done that yet. She found out later they'd meant to do it the previous afternoon and simply hadn't gotten to it. Small mercies. She'd take them. The freight elevator brought her to the 2nd floor, and she moved through the back corridor toward the trauma bay, staying in the hallway until she could see through the window what was happening inside. It was chaos, but organized chaos. The specific kind that a trauma team produces when they know what they're doing and they're moving hard. She could see 2 nurses she recognized from night shift, the trauma attending on call, a respiratory tech pulling a vent into position. And standing at the entrance to the trauma bay, blocking the doorway with his body in a way that wasn't subtle at all, was a man in military utilities who was about 6'2" and had the particular stillness of someone trained to be the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. Captain Voss. Had to be. She pushed through the stairwell door into the main corridor and walked toward him, and he saw her coming from 30 feet away, and his posture changed. Not relaxed exactly, but something in his shoulders acknowledged her. "Major Donovan," he said. "I'm not active," she said, same as she'd texted because it was still true. "You're here." "I'm here as a private individual who was personally requested by the patient." He almost smiled. "However you want to frame it, he's been asking for you since we loaded him at the forward site. We almost lost him twice in transit." He stepped aside enough for her to see into the trauma bay. Rafe Drummond was on the gurney, and he looked bad. She'd seen him in worse shape. She'd seen him with blast fragments in his shoulder and a concussion bad enough that he couldn't track faces. But this was close. His face was the color of old concrete. There was an IO line in his left tibia because his peripheral access had collapsed, and someone had packed his right side with a dressing that was already dark at the edges. The trauma attending, a younger man she vaguely recognized as Dr. Solis, was moving with confidence, but there was something in his eyes when he looked up and caught her through the window. A flicker of something uncertain. Drummond's BP was on the board. 84/50 and trending. "What's the attending's experience with blast abdomen?" she asked Voss. "He's competent. He hasn't dealt with this injury pattern before." "Who's the senior surgeon on tonight?" Voss's expression shifted. "That's the problem." She already knew the answer before he said it. "Hale got called in," Voss said. "He's on his way from the physician lounge. Someone called him when we landed." She looked at Drummond on the gurney, at the dark dressing on his right flank, at the BP reading that had dropped 3 more points in the time she'd been standing there. "He needs a damage control approach," she said, "not a primary repair. If Hale goes in there trying to do a full repair on a blast abdomen with that pressure, he'll lose him on the table." Can you stop him? I'm a suspended nurse with no standing in this building. Can you stop him? Voss repeated in a tone that suggested he was not particularly interested in the administrative nuances. She pushed open the trauma bay door. Dr. Solis looked up when she walked in, and there was a half-second where he was clearly about to tell her she couldn't be in there, and then he looked at Voss behind her and at the two soldiers who had quietly materialized in the doorway, and he made the calculation that most reasonable people make when soldiers appear. He let it go for now. His pressure's dropping, Solis said, which she could already see. What's your plan? She asked. We're resuscitating. I've got surgery on the way. Who's coming? Dr. Hale. Does Dr. Hale know this is a blast pattern injury with probable mesenteric involvement? Solis hesitated. I briefed him on the phone. Did you tell him the mechanism was military IED exposure, or did you tell him it was a blunt trauma abdomen? Another hesitation, and that hesitation told her everything. The call was brief, Solis said carefully. So he's coming in expecting a standard trauma exploratory. He's going to want to do a primary repair. She moved to the head of the gurney and looked at Drummond's face. His eyes were half open, not tracking well. She put 2 fingers on his wrist, not for the pulse. The monitor had that. But because she'd found over years of field work that touch did something to patients that monitors couldn't. Something about the nervous system registering the presence of another person. Rafe, she said, it's Donovan. His eyes moved. Slowly, and not all the way, but they moved. Hey, he said, and his voice was wrecked, low and rough, and about 30% of its normal volume. I need you to stay awake for a minute. I'm awake. He wasn't entirely, but he was trying. Told them to get you. I know. I'm here. She looked up at Solis. He needs a staged approach. Pack and close, 24-hour resuscitation in the ICU, then definitive repair when he's stable. If someone goes in there right now and tries to fix everything at once, his coegs are going to fall apart on the table. Solis was listening. She could see him doing the math, weighing what she was saying against the professional risk of agreeing with a suspended nurse in front of 2 soldiers, and God knows who else was about to walk through the door. You're not on staff here currently, he said. I'm aware. I'm telling you what I know from field experience with this injury pattern. What you do with it is your call. He looked at the BP monitor. Then he looked at Drummond. Then he said, get me the massive transfusion protocol, now. Marcus Hale came through the trauma bay doors at 5:31 a.m. still buttoning his white coat, which meant he'd come from the physician lounge rather than home, which meant he'd been in the building when the helicopter landed. She filed that away. He saw her before he saw anything else in the room. She watched his face do something complicated. Surprise first, then something that moved quickly through several other things before landing on controlled anger. He stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Then he kept moving toward the gurney. What is she doing in here? He said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just as a flat factual question directed at no one in particular, the way you'd ask why a piece of equipment was in the wrong place. She was requested by the patient, Voss said from the doorway. She's on suspension. She has no standing in this trauma bay. Hale moved to the gurney and looked at the monitor and the documentation that Solis had running. What's the injury? Blast abdomen, Solis said. IED mechanism. Right flank penetrating, probable mesenteric shearing. Then we need to go to the OR. Get him prepped. Hale reached for the chart. I've started the MTP, Solis said. I'd like to get his pressure up before we move. We don't have time to wait on pressure. If there's active bleeding, we stop it in the OR. Hale looked at the team. Who ordered the MTP? A beat of silence. I did, Solis said. Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Leah. And she could see it. The instant he made the connection, the second he understood that she'd been in this room before he arrived and that Solis had been talking to her. Get her out of this bay, Hale said. Now. Dr. Hale. Voss's voice was not loud, but it had the specific quality of someone who was accustomed to being heard the first time. This patient is a classified military asset under federal medical protection. The individuals in this room at the time of his arrival are part of the documented care chain. Removing someone from that chain requires authorization. I don't believe you have. Hale turned to look at him fully. He was not an easy man to intimidate. His whole career had been built on the kind of confidence that didn't flinch in high-pressure rooms. But Voss was a different species of unmovable than anyone Hale usually encountered, and it showed in the small recalibration that happened in Hale's expression. "What unit are you with?" Hale said. "3rd Special Operations Medical Support, attached to the 19th Group, and I'd like to get back to the patient, if you don't mind." Hale turned back to the gurney. He picked up the chart, read for a moment, and then said, "His pressure is low but not incompatible with OR transport. I want him upstairs in 10 minutes. "His lactate is 8.2, Leah said. He didn't look at her. "I didn't ask." "His coagulation panel isn't back yet. His temp is 35.1. He's in the lethal triad, and you want to open him on a table." She kept her voice level. "A damage control approach gives him a better chance of surviving to definitive repair. You are not a physician. I've managed this injury pattern in the field 6 times. I know what happens when you do a primary repair on a blast abdomen before the patient is physiologically stable. I've watched it happen." She held his gaze. "I've also watched the family notification that comes after." The room was quiet, in the specific way that rooms get quiet when something important is being decided. Solis looked at Hale. "The coag panel should be back in 4 minutes. Can we wait 4 minutes?" Hale put the chart down. He looked at the monitor. He looked at Drummond, who was not unconscious but was not exactly present either, somewhere in the gray zone between the two, where critically ill patients spent hours before they went one way or the other. 4 minutes, Hale said. The coagulation panel came back in 3. The numbers were what she'd expected and worse than Solis had anticipated, and she watched the attending read them and then look at Hale with an expression that was professional in its composure but not in its meaning. Hale stood very still for a moment. "We'll do a staged approach," he said, as if it had been his idea from the beginning. "Pack and close, ICU resuscitation, back to the OR in 24 hours. Nobody in the room said anything about the previous 10 minutes. Drummond went upstairs at 6:04 a.m., stable enough to move, the MTP running, 2 of Voss's soldiers walking alongside the gurney in a way that left no ambiguity about who was responsible for this patient's safety. Solis went with him. Hale waited until the gurney was out of the bay. Then he turned to Leah. "You don't have a badge," he said. "You don't have authorization to be in this hospital. The next time someone has to tell you that, it's going to involve law enforcement." She thought about the photograph on her phone. She thought about the document header and the date and the quiet little word irregularities sitting in the middle of an inspector general's report. She thought about Terry Ash, who'd gone home with incomplete documentation of what had actually happened to her on that table. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He left. The trauma bay emptied out behind him, nurses moving to reset, the respiratory tech wheeling the vent back to the wall, everyone returning to the ordinary machinery of a hospital morning. Leah stood next to the gurney that still held the impression of Drummond's weight and looked at the monitor that was now showing nothing because there was no longer a patient connected to it. Voss appeared beside her, sighed. "That could have gone worse," he said. "It's not done," she said. "No." He reached into the front pocket of his utilities and produced a folded piece of paper. "It's not. We found more than the contract document in transit." He held the paper out to her. "One of my people has been running a separate inquiry for the last 6 weeks. Unrelated to you. It started as a background review on the hospital's military contracting history because Drummond's unit has used this facility twice before and there were anomalies in the billing records that didn't add up." He paused. "It turns out the anomalies in the billing records connect to the anomalies in the clinical documentation, which connect to something that's significantly bigger than what you found." She took the paper and unfolded it. It was a summary document, 4 paragraphs, dense with case numbers and dates. The dates ran back 3 years. The cases were not all from Crestfall. Some were from a hospital in a different part of the state. Some were from a period before Hale had been at Crestfall at all. And the pattern wasn't just altered post-op notes and buried complications. There was a billing code manipulation scheme. Systematic. Documented across dozens of cases. Procedures billed at a complexity level they hadn't reached. Implants billed as used that hadn't been opened. And threaded through it, a series of consulting payments that moved through the defense medical contractor, the one from the contract document, and back out the other side into accounts that were not, as far as she could tell from the summary, affiliated with any legitimate medical institution. She looked at Voss. "How long has your person been building this?" 6 weeks. But the original data trail goes back further. Someone else started it. Who? He looked at her steadily. A patient advocate at this hospital named Ruth Okafor. She filed an internal complaint 14 months ago. The complaint was formally closed as unsubstantiated. He paused. Ruth Okafor is no longer employed here. Leah folded the paper. He does this to everyone who gets close. He's had practice, Voss said, and he's good at it. But there's a limit to how many trails you can bury before someone finds the shovel. She put the paper in her jacket pocket. What do you need from me? The documentation you have on the 3 post-operative cases, the original timestamps, the amendment dates, everything you found. We need it in a format that can be submitted to the Inspector General's office as part of a formal referral. My inquiry gives us the financial pattern. Your clinical findings give us the patient harm component. Together, he stopped. Together, it's a federal case. She thought about the notebook in her jacket pocket, the photographs on her phone, the 8 months of watching and noting and keeping quiet because she hadn't known where to take it. When do you need it? We file the referral at 9 a.m. The IG's office has a field representative who can be here by early afternoon if we flag it as time sensitive. He looked at her. There's something else you should know. She waited. Hale knows something is happening. He doesn't know the scope yet, but he knows more than he showed you in that trauma bay. Before he came downstairs, between when we landed and when he walked into that bay, he made 2 phone calls. My people tracked the numbers. One was to the hospital's chief legal officer. He paused. The other was to a physician on the state medical licensing board. She understood what that meant. He wasn't just trying to protect himself from her complaint anymore. He was trying to get ahead of something. He had sources somewhere, people who'd told him that the suspended nurse from the 3rd floor wasn't his only problem, and he was already starting to build the narrative that would position him as the wronged party rather than the subject of an investigation. He's going to try to move first, she said. Yes. How long before he figures out how much you actually have? Voss considered. If his contacts are good, a few hours, maybe less. She looked at the trauma bay around her. The clean floor, the empty monitor, the reset equipment lined up along the walls. 8 months she'd worked in rooms like this. 8 months of doing her job better than she needed to and saying less than she wanted to, and watching a man build his protection layer by layer while the people around him absorbed the damage. I need to make a call, she said. To who? Dana Yee. Night shift. She was going to try to flag the workstation camera footage before the 72-hour cycle. Voss pulled out his phone. Don't use your personal number for anything related to this from this point forward. He held the phone out. Use mine. She took it and stepped to the far side of the bay and dialed Dana's number from memory. Dana picked up on the second ring, which meant she was still at the hospital, which meant she was still on shift. It's me, Leah said. Were you able to flag the footage? A pause. I tried. I put in a request to the security supervisor at 3 a.m. saying there was a patient complaint that might require footage review from that shift. It was the only reason I could give without explaining everything. Another pause, shorter. Leah, the supervisor told me the footage from that specific workstation had already been flagged for review. She felt something cold run up the back of her neck. By who? By Dr. Hale's office. The request came in at 2 p.m. yesterday, before you were even called into the conference room. She stood very still. He had flagged the footage before the meeting, before they'd suspended her. He had flagged the workstation footage at 2 p.m. and called her into the conference room at 3 p.m., which meant the footage review was part of the plan, not evidence collection after the fact, but advance work to control what the camera had captured before anyone else could get to it. Who authorized the actual review? Who has access to that footage right now? That's the thing, Dana's voice had dropped. The request is listed as under active review by hospital security, but hospital security doesn't do their own digital forensics. They send it to the third-party IT contractor, and that contractor's contact person on our account is someone listed as an administrative contact in Dr. Hale's department. Leah closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and said, Don't do anything else. Don't ask any more questions about the footage. Just finish your shift and go home. Are you okay? I'm working on it. She ended the call and turned to find Voss watching her from across the bay with the particular attentiveness of someone who already knew the general shape of what she'd just learned. "The camera footage is being managed by someone connected to Hale," she said. "Then we don't rely on the camera footage," he said. "It was the cleanest evidence of the timestamp discrepancy." "I know, but we have 17 other pieces that he can't reach." He looked at her steadily. "The question is whether we can get those 17 pieces organized and submitted before he figures out what we're building." From somewhere above them, above the ceiling, above the floors of a hospital that had spent the last 8 months treating her like a piece of furniture, there was the muffled sound of footsteps moving fast in the corridor that led to the administrative wing. More than one person. Moving with purpose. Voss cocked his head toward the sound. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, but the specific attention of someone recalibrating a timeline. "That's faster than I expected," he said quietly. "What is?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second folded document that she hadn't known he was carrying. He held it out to her, and when she took it and looked at it, she saw a hospital letterhead she recognized, and a signature at the bottom that belonged to Crestfall's chief executive officer, and the text in between contained her name and the words security escort and trespassing and immediate removal. "He didn't go back to the physician lounge," she said. "No," Voss said. "He went straight to the CEO's office." A pause. "Which means he has more pull with administration than I estimated." The footsteps were getting closer. She looked at the document in her hand, her own removal order, signed and dated at 6:11 a.m., 10 minutes after Hale had walked out of the trauma bay where she'd just kept his patient alive with information he hadn't wanted to hear. She looked at Voss. "Your inquiry," she said. "The federal referral. Does it have enough to move even without my clinical documentation?" "It has enough to open, not enough to close. And without the camera footage, we have the financial trail, the billing records, the contract document." He met her eyes. "But the patient harm component is what makes it a criminal referral rather than an administrative one. And the patient harm component needs what you have." The footsteps stopped outside the trauma bay. Someone knocked, a sharp official knock, the kind that was not really a knock but a notification. She looked at the folded document. She looked at the door. She thought about the notebook in her jacket pocket and the photographs on her phone and the 8 months of small, careful noticing that had brought her to this exact room at this exact moment, suspended and technically trespassing and holding a removal order in one hand, and the only thing standing between a corrupt surgeon and a federal investigation in the other. She thought about Ruth Okafor, who had filed a complaint 14 months ago and lost her job for it. The door to the trauma bay opened. 2 security officers stepped inside, and behind them, just visible in the corridor, was Marcus Hale, with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had decided he'd won this particular round. The same expression she'd seen in the workstation 3 days ago when he'd smiled at her and told her to worry about keeping her job. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then, from somewhere behind Hale, from down the corridor, from the direction of the elevators, came a sound that changed everything. A voice she recognized, moving fast, speaking with the particular authority of someone who was used to being the most important person in any situation and was entirely comfortable with that fact. "Captain Voss." The voice cut through the corridor before its owner was visible. "I need you and Major Donovan in the ICU, right now." Drummond. Not the voice of a man who'd been on a gurney 20 minutes ago with a BP of 84/50. Not the voice of someone in the gray zone between present and gone. Sharp, focused, and carrying about 3 floors worth of institutional weight. Hale turned. And Rafe Drummond, Commander. Rafe Drummond, still in a hospital gown with an IV line in his arm and a soldier on each side of him who were clearly not happy about the fact that he'd gotten himself out of the ICU bed, walked into the corridor and looked at Marcus Hale with the kind of flat assessment that certain people reserved for problems they intended to solve rather than manage. "You're Dr. Hale," Drummond said. It wasn't a question. Hale stared at him. "You should be in the ICU." "I'll be in the ICU in 2 minutes. First," Drummond looked past him at Leah, and despite everything, despite the IV and the hospital gown and the fact that he was visibly not stable enough to be upright, there was something in his face that was entirely, recognizably him. "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm fine." "Good." He looked back at Hale. "Then let's talk about what's on your personnel file from 7 years ago, Doctor. Because I have a field representative from the Inspector General's office on a call right now who has some questions, and I'd like you to be part of that conversation. The corridor outside the trauma bay was not designed for confrontations of this specific kind. It was 8 feet wide, fluorescent lit, lined on one side with supply carts, and on the other with the kind of motivational hospital artwork that nobody ever actually looked at. It was a utilitarian space built for moving equipment and people from one place to another, and what it had become at 6:14 in the morning was a standoff involving a chief trauma surgeon, 2 hospital security officers, a suspended nurse, a military captain, and a decorated special operations commander who was standing upright through what appeared to be sheer refusal to do otherwise, one hand gripping an IV pole that one of his soldiers was holding at the right angle to keep the line from pulling. Drummond's color was bad. She could see it even from across the corridor. The gray-white of someone whose body was running on emergency reserves, redistributing blood away from the periphery to keep the core functioning. He was upright because he'd decided to be upright, and that decision was costing him something measurable. Hale looked at him the way physicians sometimes looked at patients who were doing something inadvisable, a mix of professional concern and the specific frustration of someone whose authority was being complicated by another person's bad choices. "You need to go back to the ICU," Hale said. "Your pressure." "My pressure is 96/60 and trending up," Drummond said. "I functioned on worse." He looked past Hale at the 2 security officers. "You 2 can go." The security officers looked at Hale. Hale looked at Drummond. There was a brief moment where the hierarchy of the situation sorted itself out in real time, and the security officers apparently concluded that the man in the hospital gown with the military unit behind him outranked their directive, because they both stepped back a half pace without actually leaving. "Commander," Voss said quietly from beside Leah, "you have an open abdominal pack and a temp of 35.4. "I know what I have, Voss." "Get the IG contact on the phone. Speakerphone." "Sir, this is not the place. The man who runs this department just issued a trespassing order against the person who kept me alive 40 minutes ago." Drummond's voice hadn't risen. That was the thing about him. She'd forgotten it in 4 years and now remembered it completely. How his voice actually got quieter when things got worse, like he was conserving energy for what mattered. "This is exactly the place." Voss looked at Leah. She gave him nothing because she genuinely didn't know what the right move was. Drummond being in this corridor was simultaneously the best thing that could have happened and a medical situation that was one wrong turn from becoming critical. Hale seemed to reach the same conclusion from a different direction. "Whatever grievance you have with hospital administration," he said, "this is not how it gets resolved. This patient," he gestured at Drummond with the controlled patience of a man who had talked difficult people down from difficult positions before, "needs surgical follow-up in approximately 22 hours. If his condition destabilizes because he's standing in a corridor instead of resting in the ICU, the outcome of whatever investigation you're referencing becomes significantly less important." He paused. "I'm not asking you to drop anything. I'm asking you to do it from a bed." It was, Leah thought, genuinely good. It was the exact argument most likely to work on a man like Drummond because it was framed as mission logic rather than institutional authority, and Drummond responded to mission logic. Drummond looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. She thought about the notebook, the photographs, the summary document in her jacket pocket. She thought about Ruth Okafor and Terry Ash and the 12 other cases she hadn't finished going through. "An hour," she said. "And somewhere in this building I can use that isn't a trauma bay." Drummond looked at Voss. "Find her a room." "Sir." "Find her a room, get the IG on the phone, and then you can take me back upstairs." He looked at Hale one more time. The look wasn't threatening. It was something colder than threatening. It was the assessment of someone filing information away for later use with the patience to wait for later. "We'll continue this conversation, Doctor." Hale said nothing. Drummond let the soldiers steer him back toward the elevator. Leah watched him go and felt the particular complicated feeling of being grateful for something that scared her, because Drummond's blood pressure had been 96/60 on a good read, and the packed dressing on his right flank wasn't a permanent solution, and she'd already run the numbers on what happened if he was back in that OR in 22 hours and his coags hadn't recovered. She couldn't think about that now. Voss touched her elbow. "Conference room B on the 4th floor. I cleared it 10 minutes ago." She turned and walked. Well, Conference room B was a small, windowless space used for administrative meetings. with a table that seated 6 and a whiteboard that someone had written Budget Review Q4 on and never erased. Voss set up a laptop and a secure phone connection while Leah spread everything she had across one end of the table. The notebook opened to the first relevant page, her phone displaying the photographs in sequence. The summary document Voss had given her laid flat beside them. There was a third person in the room she hadn't met yet. A woman named Specialist Tara Briggs, Voss's documentation analyst, who sat down across from Leah's materials with a tablet and a posture that suggested she had done this specific kind of work before and found it interesting in a quiet, professional way. "Walk me through the 3 cases in order," Briggs said, starting with dates. Leah walked her through it. She'd done this in her head so many times that it came out clean and sequential, the way things do when you've rehearsed them alone at your kitchen table at midnight. The November case first, the amendment timestamps, the discrepancy between the operative note and the nursing post-op record. Then the second case from February, where the billing code for the procedure didn't match the instrument count documentation she'd seen in the equipment log. Then the third case from 6 weeks ago, the one that had pushed her from uneasy to certain. Briggs typed as she talked, asked 2 clarifying questions, both precise. Voss had the IG field contact, a woman named Agent Mercer, on the secure line, and she listened to the summary without interrupting. When Leah finished, Mercer said, "The February billing discrepancy. Can you access the instrument count log currently from outside the system?" "No, I'm suspended. I don't have credentials." "Could you access it physically? Is it a paper log or electronic?" "Electronic, same EMR system." "Voss," Mercer said. "We have a subpoena application queued," Voss said. "If Mercer confirms she's opening a formal inquiry, we can serve it within the hour." A pause on the line. Leah listened to the quality of the silence and thought it was the kind that preceded a yes. "Open it," Mercer said. "Flag it as time-sensitive with potential evidence interference. I want a system preservation order on the Crestfall EMR before end of business today." Voss made a note. Briggs kept typing. Leah sat back in her chair and felt something shift that she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, nothing as clean as that, but a loosening in the specific knot that had been sitting between her shoulder blades for 8 months. The thing she'd been carrying alone had other hands on it now. It was still heavy. It wasn't going away. But she wasn't the only one holding it. She looked at the whiteboard. Budget Review Q4 in blue dry erase that had been there long enough to start fading at the edges. She thought about Earl Briggs in bed 4 14 months ago and the Troponin flag she'd raised that Marcus Hale had walked past without blinking. She wondered how many things he'd walked past. The answer started coming at 7:40 a.m. when Briggs cross-referenced Leah's 3 cases against the financial trail from Voss's 6-week inquiry and found 8 additional patient accounts with anomalies in the billing records. 8 more. Not all of them were Hale's surgical cases. 3 were cases he'd overseen as attending, where the procedure had been performed by a resident and the billing had gone through under Hale's credentials. In those 3 cases, the complexity code billed to the payer was 1 tier higher than what the clinical documentation supported. 1 tier. A small thing, if you weren't looking for it. The kind of small thing that added up. Briggs pulled up a number on her tablet and showed it to Leah without saying anything. It was a cumulative figure representing the billing differential across the 11 cases they'd now identified, the gap between what was documented and what was charged. Leah looked at the number. Then she looked at Briggs. "Over what period?" she said. 14 months, Briggs said. "What we can verify. The pattern likely starts earlier." She thought about the contract document, the consulting payments that moved through the defense contractor and back out the other side. She was not a forensic accountant, and she didn't fully understand the mechanism, but the rough shape of it was becoming visible the way shapes become visible when you've been sitting in the dark long enough and your eyes have adjusted. A surgeon who billed at inflated codes. A contractor who paid consulting fees that didn't correspond to any documented service. Money moving in a circle that looked like legitimate business from the right angle. The question was what the money was buying. She said, "The cases with the altered post-op documentation, do they cluster with any of the overbilled cases?" Briggs checked. 2 overlap. "Which 2? Briggs gave her the dates. She looked at them and felt the shape click into something more specific. The altered documentation wasn't random error covering. It was targeted. The cases where Hale had changed the post-op notes were cases where the complication rate created a quality flag, and quality flags triggered mandatory reporting, and mandatory reporting meant regulatory scrutiny, and regulatory scrutiny meant someone might look more carefully at the billing. He hadn't just been covering up mistakes, he'd been protecting the revenue stream. She said this to Voss. He looked at her for a moment, then at Briggs, and something passed between them that she recognized as the specific communication of people who have been working together long enough to shorthand entire conversations. "Get that to Mercer," he said to Briggs. Briggs was already typing. "What?" At 8:22 a.m., the door to conference room. B opened without a knock. The man who walked in was not someone Leah recognized, but she recognized the category immediately. Mid-50s, good suit, the careful blankness of someone whose job was to manage liability rather than solve problems. He introduced himself as Warren Aldis, Crestfall Memorial's chief legal officer. "I need to speak with someone in authority here," he said to the room at large, which was a way of not addressing Leah directly that she noted and set aside. Voss said, "You're speaking with Captain Voss, 3rd Medical Support. What do you need?" Aldis looked at Voss, then at Leah, then at the materials spread across the table. His gaze snagged on the notebook and the photographs for half a second, long enough for her to see him register them, before he looked back at Voss. "The hospital is prepared to cooperate fully with any military inquiry regarding the care of Commander Drummond," he said. "We'd like to formalize that cooperation through a structured process rather than—" He gestured at the conference room in a way that encompassed all of it. "This is already a formal process," Voss said. "We have an active inquiry open with the Inspector General's office." Aldis's expression didn't change, which was impressive, and also told her he'd already known that. Someone had told him. Hale, most likely, or Hale's contact at the licensing board who'd fed it back through. "The hospital has concerns," Aldis said carefully, "about the participation of a suspended employee in an official inquiry process. Ms. Donovan's access to confidential patient records during a period of active suspension may constitute a separate compliance issue." She had been waiting for this. Voss said, "The documentation Ms. Donovan has provided reflects observations made during the course of her normal duties prior to her suspension. The suspension itself is currently under review as a potentially retaliatory action." "That's a characterization. It's a documented timeline," Voss said. "Ms. Donovan brought concerns about clinical documentation to Dr. Hale's attention on a Thursday. The falsified medication order was entered using her credentials the following Monday, after she'd left the building, as confirmed by badge scan records. She was suspended Tuesday morning." He looked at Aldis steadily. "We have the badge scan records. We have the system entry timestamp. We have a preservation order incoming on the EMR audit log. If the hospital's legal position is that Ms. Donovan's suspension was legitimate, I'd encourage you to have the documentation ready to support that because the timeline is going to be reviewed." Aldis was quiet for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet than the one Hale had used in the workstation 3 days ago. Hale's quiet had been confident, strategic. This quiet was the quiet of someone recalculating. "I'll need to consult with the board," he said. "That's your prerogative," Voss said. "The inquiry moves forward regardless." Aldis left. Leah let out a breath she hadn't been fully aware of holding. "He's going to move fast," she said. "So are we," Voss said. What she hadn't accounted for, because she'd been focused on the documentation and the timeline, and the 8 additional cases that Briggs was still cross-referencing, was that Marcus Hale had been building his counteroffensive at the same time. She found out what it looked like at 9:07 a.m. When Dana called Voss's phone. She'd given Dana the number before the shift change, and Dana's voice was tight in the way it got when she was trying to keep something controlled. "There's a meeting," Dana said. "Nursing administration. They're pulling 6 nurses into a room right now. Everyone who worked the shift the night of the medication incident. They're doing individual interviews." "About what?" Leah said. "About you. About your behavior on the unit. Whether you'd ever accessed patient records outside your assignment, whether you'd ever seemed—" Dana paused, and Leah could hear her choosing the word carefully. "Unstable." She understood the architecture of it immediately. He was building a parallel narrative. Not just that she'd made a medication error. He was going to make the case that she was an erratic employee with a pattern of boundary violations. Someone whose complaint about clinical documentation was the product of instability rather than evidence. Someone whose presence in the building this morning was further proof of poor judgment. He was going to make the investigation about her rather than about him, and he was going to do it using her colleagues as the source material. "Who's running the interviews?" she said. "HR director and someone I don't recognize. Woman in a gray blazer." She looked at Voss. "Legal counsel," he said. "They brought outside counsel in." That was fast. "He had them on standby," Voss said, and the flatness in his voice told her he was not surprised. "This isn't improvised. He's had a contingency plan." She thought about that for a moment. Thought about a man who ran a contingency plan for the possibility that a nurse might bring documented concerns about his record-keeping to an outside authority. Thought about what that meant for how long he'd known the documentation was vulnerable. Thought about Ruth Okafor, who'd filed a complaint 14 months ago and been walked out of the building before it could go anywhere. She said to Dana, "Don't say anything that isn't true. Don't let them characterize things for you. If they say, 'Would you describe her as erratic?' say you describe her as thorough. Use your own words." "Leah, I can't." "I know. Just use your own words. That's all." She ended the call. Briggs looked up from her tablet. "The nursing interview process? Does it interfere with what we're building?" "It's not meant to interfere with the investigation," Leah said. "It's meant to interfere with how I look during the investigation." She looked at the table, at the notebook and the photographs, at 11 cases with documented anomalies. "He's not going to try to destroy the evidence anymore. He knows we have too much and that the preservation order is coming. He's going to try to destroy the witness instead." "You," Briggs said. "Me," Voss said. "Then we need to make the witness secondary to the documentation." He looked at her. "Everything you've provided needs to be independently verifiable without your testimony. Can Mercer work with what we have and build the case without relying on you as the primary source?" She thought about it honestly. "The 3 post-op cases. 2 of them, yes. The documentation speaks for itself if the audit log shows the amendment timestamps. The 3rd one is more complicated because the discrepancy is between the operative note and the nursing record, and the nursing record was mine." Would another nurse corroborate the nursing record? She thought about who'd been on during the 3rd case. Possibly. There was a float nurse named Patricia Osei who was in the room during part of that recovery. She documented separately. Briggs typed the name. "We'll need her contacted independently," Voss said. "Not through you." "Understood." The door opened again, and this time it was one of Voss's soldiers. Not one of the 2 who'd been with Drummond, a 3rd one she hadn't met, who stood in the doorway with the compact alertness of someone delivering news that wasn't good. "Sir," he said, "Dr. Hale has called a department meeting. All ER attending physicians and senior nursing staff. In 10 minutes, in the main conference room on the 2nd floor. Voss looked at Leah. "He's briefing his people before we can," she said. "On what?" "On whatever version of this he wants them to have first." She stood up. "I need to be in that meeting." "You'll be removed." "Not immediately. It takes time to physically remove someone. And if I'm removed from a department meeting on the same morning the IG opens a formal inquiry, that's part of the record too." Voss studied her for a moment. She could see him running the calculation, the risk, the utility, the possibility that she was wrong about the timing and got walked out before she heard anything useful. 2 minutes in that room is worth more than anything I can read about it afterward, she said. He's going to tell them something that shapes how every person in that department sees what's happening. Once they hear his version, it anchors. That's how it works. Voss said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, "Briggs, timestamp our current documentation status for the formal record. I want it noted that at 9:14 a.m., the inquiry materials were complete and in the custody of this unit." He looked at Leah. "If they move to remove you, you walk. Don't make it a scene." She was already moving toward the door. Whoa. The main conference room on the 2nd floor was a larger space than conference room B. It could seat 20, and it was filling up as she came down the hall. She walked in through the side entrance, not the main doors, and positioned herself near the back wall beside a supply cabinet where she had sight lines to the front of the room and to both exits. She recognized most of the faces. Nurses she'd worked alongside for 8 months. Residents she'd handed charts to, called codes with, stood next to in trauma bays at 3 in the morning when the work was what held everything together. A few of the attending physicians she knew less well, ER doctors, the overnight hospitalist, the day shift charge nurses in a cluster near the left side of the room. Nobody said anything to her. A few people looked at her. One of the day shift nurses, a woman named Gail, who'd been at Crestfall for 11 years, and who had been moderately kind to Leah in the uncomplicated way that some experienced nurses were with new staff. She looked at Leah and then looked away. Not hostilely, more like someone who was trying to figure out what the correct response was and hadn't landed on it yet. Marcus Hale walked in at 9:19, which was 4 minutes later than he'd announced, which was a choice. He came in from the main doors, moving with the particular unhurried purpose that she'd watched him deploy in every high-stakes situation she'd seen him navigate. He didn't look around the room the way people did when they were checking if a specific person was present. He went directly to the front. He waited for the room to settle. He was good at waiting. She knew that about him. "I'm going to be brief," he said. "Something is happening in this hospital that I want you to hear from me directly. We have a military unit on site who brought a classified patient in early this morning. The patient is stable and receiving appropriate care. The military unit has opened what they're describing as an inquiry that relates to some of our clinical documentation." He paused. "I want to be transparent with you about the source of that inquiry. A nurse who was placed on suspension 2 days ago for a documented medication safety error has provided information to this military unit. I can't speak to her motivations. I will tell you that her access to the documentation she's provided raises serious questions about patient privacy compliance during a period of active suspension." The room was quiet. He kept going. "I want every person in this department to know that this hospital takes clinical documentation seriously. If there are questions about our records, I welcome the review. I have nothing to hide." He looked out at the room with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this and knew exactly where the weight of each sentence landed. "What I do want you to think carefully about is the difference between a legitimate concern and a disgruntled employee who's looking to cause harm to an institution and the colleagues she worked alongside." She listened to him deliver it and understood exactly how effective it was. He hadn't attacked her directly. He'd raised questions. He'd positioned himself as transparent and welcoming of review. He'd used the phrase disgruntled employee, which activated a specific set of associations in anyone who'd ever dealt with a difficult coworker situation, and he'd done it in a room full of people who'd spent 8 months seeing Leah as the nurse who restocked supplies and handled the hard patients and never quite fit. He had not said a single untrue thing. That was the most dangerous part. She pushed off the wall. "I have a question," she said. The room turned. She watched it happen. The slow rotation of 20-some people noticing her at the back of the room, and then looking at Hale, and then looking back at her. Gail's expression shifted into something that was almost alarm. One of the residents' mouths opened slightly. Hale looked at her. He was very good. His expression moved through surprise in about half a second and came out the other side into something controlled and careful, the expression of someone who had been interrupted in a context they hadn't prepared for but was not going to show that. "Ms. Donovan," he said, "this meeting is for Crestfall medical staff," she said. "I was on staff here for 8 months. I'd like to ask a question." She looked at the room, not at him, at Gail, at the residents, at the day shift charge nurse whose name she knew was Vincent and who had covered for the night shift twice during weeks she'd worked doubles. The November case. Terry Ash, post-surgical abdominal repair. The operative note was amended 3 days after discharge. Does anyone in this room know who authorized that amendment? Silence. Because the amendment timestamp is in the system. It's not hidden. It's just something you'd have to know to look for. She looked back at Hale. I looked for it. I found 3 cases. The military inquiry has found 11. Hale said, "This is not the appropriate venue." "You made it the venue," she said. "You called this meeting. You chose to tell your version of this in a room full of people who have worked in this department and taken care of patients in this department. Those same people deserve to know that there are 11 documented cases currently under federal review. You are trespassing in this building. I'm talking to my colleagues." She looked at the room one more time, at the faces that were unreadable, uncertain, some of them clearly uncomfortable in the way people got uncomfortable when a thing they'd suspected but not examined was suddenly in front of them. The medication order that got me suspended was entered at 11:47 p.m. I left this building at 10:15 p.m. My badge scan is in the security log. I didn't enter that order. Someone used my credentials after I left. She paused. I don't know who in this room knew that, and I don't know who didn't, but you know now. Hale took 2 steps toward her. I'm going to have security escort you out, he said, and his voice was still controlled, but something in it had shifted, a tightness at the edges that hadn't been there during his prepared remarks. And I'm going to have your unauthorized presence in this building this morning included in the documentation of your suspension. That's your right, she said. She turned and walked out through the side entrance. She made it to the hallway and kept walking, steady pace, not looking back. Her hands were trembling slightly, which she was aware of and could not entirely stop, but she kept them at her sides and kept moving toward the stairwell. She heard footsteps behind her. Not the heavy boot sound of security, something lighter. She glanced back. Gail. Moving fast, catching up, a look on her face that Leah couldn't categorize. The ash case, Gail said, when she got close enough to speak quietly. The post-op nursing record. I co-signed it. You were the primary, but I co-signed it. She stopped. If the operative note doesn't match what we documented, there are 2 of us who saw what we saw. Leah looked at her. Gail looked back, uncomfortable and resolute in equal measure. I'm not doing it for you specifically. I'm doing it because I co-signed that record and I know what was in it, and it doesn't match what I was told at the time. She paused. Who do I talk to? 4th floor, conference room B. Ask for Specialist Briggs. Gail nodded once. She turned back toward the conference room. Leah went up the stairs. She was halfway between the 2nd and 3rd floor when her phone, Voss's phone, buzzed in her pocket. She stopped on the landing and looked at the screen. It was Briggs, and the message was not text. It was a photograph taken of a computer monitor, displaying what looked like an email chain. She enlarged it with 2 fingers and read the first visible line, and then read it again because her brain took a second to process what it was showing her. The email chain was dated. The most recent message was from 6:48 a.m., 40 minutes after Hale had walked out of the trauma bay. It was addressed to 3 recipients, the names partially cut off at the edge of the screenshot. The message body was 3 sentences. She could read 2 of them clearly. The situation is escalating beyond what we anticipated. The documentation she has may be more comprehensive than we realized. We need to move on the 2nd protocol before the subpoena lands. She stood on the stairwell landing and looked at the words 2nd protocol and felt the specific cold quality of understanding something that you hadn't known to be afraid of yet. She called Briggs. Where did this come from? She said, before Briggs could speak. IT audit from Drummond's unit. One of his technical specialists has been running a passive intercept on the hospital's outgoing server. It's within the scope of the federal inquiry. This email came through at 6:48 this morning. Who are the 3 recipients? That's the problem, Briggs said. 2 of the addresses are partially obfuscated. They're routing through a proxy. The 3rd one we can read. Who is it? A pause. Brief, but real. The 3rd recipient is an address registered to a physician at the State Medical Licensing Board, Briggs said. The same board that received a call from Hale's office at 5:30 this morning. She stood very still on the landing. What's the 2nd protocol? She said. We don't know yet. Another pause. But Major, the email mentions documentation. Specifically, documentation she has. Which means whoever Hale is communicating with knows you have materials, knows what those materials contain, which means someone has told them. She thought about who knew. Voss, Briggs, Drummond, Mercer on the phone, Aldis, who'd seen the materials on the table when he walked in. Aldis. Briggs, she said, tell Voss we have a leak in the building, and tell him I need to know what 2nd protocol means before it happens. She was already moving up the stairs when she heard the sound. Not footsteps, not voices. A mechanical sound from somewhere above her, the specific thunk of a server room door or a secure cabinet, something heavy and locked and deliberate. The sound of someone making something inaccessible before an order came through to preserve it. She stopped, listened. The sound came from the 4th floor, the floor where the hospital's primary medical record server room was located, the floor she was heading to. She took the remaining stairs at a run. She hit the 4th floor landing at a run and pushed through the stairwell door into the corridor and stopped. The hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights, the same motivational artwork as every other floor. A wheeled medication cart parked against the wall at the far end. Nothing obviously wrong, nothing obviously right. She stood still and listened. The server room was at the end of the hall to the left. behind a door that required a keycard and a 4-digit PIN. She knew this because she'd been sent up here twice during her first month to deliver physical documentation to the medical records coordinator, back when she was still doing the tasks nobody else wanted. The door had a small reinforced window in it, and from where she was standing she couldn't see light through it, which could mean the room was dark or could mean someone had covered the window from the inside. She walked toward it. She was 10 feet away when she heard voices behind her, from the direction she'd come, near the elevator bank. Two men, speaking in the compressed, low-register tones of people who didn't want to be overheard. She turned and saw them. One was a man in a facilities uniform she didn't recognize, and the other was wearing a Crestfall IT badge on a lanyard and carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and a portable hard drive enclosure in his other hand. The hard drive enclosure was the kind used for large-volume data transfers. She said loudly enough to carry down the hall, "What's being pulled from that room?" Both men stopped. The IT technician looked at her with the specific expression of someone who hadn't expected to be spoken to and was now recalculating whether this was a problem. "Routine maintenance," he said, "at 9:30 in the morning with a portable enclosure?" "We have a scheduled—" "Don't." She moved toward them. "The hospital's EMR system is currently under a federal preservation order. Anything you remove from that server room in the next 10 minutes is obstruction." She didn't know for certain whether the preservation order had been formally served yet. Voss had said within the hour. But she knew how to say a true thing in a way that made a person stop and think about whether they wanted to be the one holding the hard drive when the answer became clear. "Put it down." The IT technician looked at the facilities man. The facilities man looked at the hard drive enclosure. He set it on the floor. She looked at both of them and said, "Stay here," and pulled out Voss's phone and called him. He picked up on the first ring. "What floor?" "4th, server room. Someone was about to pull a portable data transfer. I don't know if they got anything out before I got here." "Briggs?" She could hear him moving as he spoke. Footsteps. A door. "Get it forensics up to 4th. Now." Then back to her. "Are you with them?" "I'm standing in front of them." "Keep standing in front of them." She kept standing in front of them. What happened in the next 22 minutes was not smooth. It was not the clean, sequential unfolding of a plan working the way plans were supposed to work. It was loud in some places and eerily quiet in others. It involved 3 separate arguments happening in 2 different locations simultaneously, and it produced exactly one moment where she genuinely didn't know what was going to happen next. Voss arrived on the 4th floor at 9:41 with Briggs and one of his soldiers, who was carrying a case of equipment that the IT technician identified, with visible alarm, as a military-grade forensic imaging kit. The portable hard drive enclosure was taken into custody, unopened. Briggs photographed it in place on the floor before touching it, which told Leah that Briggs had done this before and understood that chain of custody started at the moment of contact, not before. The IT technician, whose name turned out to be Ramon Delgado, was cooperative in the fragile way of someone who had been told by his supervisor to do a thing and was now rapidly reconsidering whether his supervisor's authority was sufficient cover for that thing. He confirmed that he'd been directed to perform the transfer by an administrative work order issued at 7:15 a.m. He confirmed that the work order had come through a request portal under the authorization of the hospital's chief legal officer. Aldis. Again. Voss photographed the work order on Delgado's phone. Briggs logged it. Voss placed a direct call to Agent Mercer, who issued an emergency verbal preservation order with formal documentation to follow within the hour. The server room was physically secured with a military seal that was, as Voss explained to the facility's manager who showed up 12 minutes later to object, legally equivalent to a federal lock and removable only by court order. The facility's manager called Aldis. Aldis didn't answer. Aldis, it turned out, had left the building at 9:38 a.m. His car was gone from the reserved parking spot on the ground level. His assistant, when reached by the front desk, said he had a personal appointment. "He ran," Leah said to Voss. "He made a calculation," Voss said. "He's trying to put distance between himself and the work order before the preservation order lands." "Does that work?" "Not particularly. We have the digital record of the authorization." Voss looked at her. "It also means Hale's institutional protection just walked out of the building. Whatever Aldis was doing to manage the hospital's response, that's gone." She thought about that. about the specific kind of vulnerability that opened up when the person managing your legal exposure decided the exposure was too much. Aldis hadn't run because he was guilty of everything. He'd run because he was guilty of enough, and had decided that loyalty to Marcus Hale was no longer a reasonable bet, which meant Hale knew he was alone now, or would know very shortly. She thought about the email. The second protocol. Still unknown. Still coming, presumably, unless the server room intervention had been it. Is the data transfer attempt the second protocol? She asked. Briggs looked up from her tablet. We don't know what was already transferred before you got there. Delgado says he'd just arrived when you stopped him, that the session hadn't opened yet. If that's true, the attempt failed. If it's not true, she shrugged. We'll know when forensics images the drive. How long? 40 minutes, maybe less. 40 minutes. She looked at the sealed server room door. At the military seal, which was a physical sticker with a QR code and a federal case number that Briggs had printed from the portable kit, affixed over the door latch in a way that made tampering physically visible. It was not dramatic, it was a sticker on a door. But the thing it represented, the formal arrival of federal authority into the ordinary infrastructure of a hospital that had been running on the confidence that nobody powerful enough would ever look, felt significant enough that she stood in front of it for a moment before she turned away. She found Drummond in the ICU at 10:04. He was back in the bed, which was a good sign, though back in the bed was doing some work as a description. He was sitting up at about 30 degrees, the head of the bed raised, with both his soldiers in the room and a nurse she didn't know charting at the corner station. His color was marginally better than it had been in the corridor. His BP on the monitor read 102/64. She stood in the doorway for a second before he noticed her. Donovan, he said, how are you feeling? Like I have an open abdominal pack and a TBI. He said it without complaint, the way someone states a weather report. What happened upstairs? She told him about the server room, about Delgado and the portable enclosure and Aldis's departure. She kept it factual and brief because he didn't need the elaborated version, and because she could see him cataloging it in real time, filing information the way he'd always done, efficiently, without visible reaction, building the picture. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The email, he said. Second protocol. What's your read? If the data transfer attempt was it, we stopped it. If it was something else, she shook her head. I don't know what else he has access to. He has access to people, Drummond said. That's always the variable. Systems you can lock down. People make decisions. He shifted slightly and then stopped, the specific arrested movement of someone whose body has issued a reminder. What's Hale doing right now? I don't know. He's in the building. Nobody's flagged him leaving. He knows the server room is sealed. By now, yes. And he knows Aldis is gone. Yes. Drummond looked at the ceiling for a moment. He's going to do something, not run. He doesn't have the exit that Aldis has. Aldis is legal counsel. There are arguments he can make. Hale has a medical license and a department and a patient population. He can't just disappear. He looked back at her. He's going to make a move that looks defensive but is actually offensive. He's going to try to reframe the entire thing in a way that makes him the person responding to wrongdoing rather than committing it. She thought about the department meeting, about the careful language, a disgruntled employee. I welcome the review. I have nothing to hide. He started that already, she said. The meeting this morning, that was a first step. He'll escalate it. Drummond's eyes were steady on her face. Is there anything in what you have that he can argue was obtained improperly? Anything that gives him a thread to pull? She thought about it honestly. The photographs she'd taken on her phone. She'd taken them during working hours, on cases that were in her clinical assignment, of documents she'd had legitimate access to at the time. The note-taking had been personal, in her own notebook, nothing pulled from the system after hours. No, she said. Everything I have, I had legitimate access to when I got it. You're sure? I'm sure. He nodded. Then he can complain about process all he wants. It doesn't change what the documents say. He paused. Who else has seen what you have? Inside the hospital, not Voss's people. Gail Merritt, a nurse on my unit. She co-signed the Ash post-op record. She went to talk to Briggs this morning. Anyone else? She thought. Possibly Dana. She knows what I told her on the phone, but she doesn't have the physical documentation. Are either of them in a position Hale can pressure? She thought about Gail. 11 years at Crestfall, 2 kids, a mortgage on a house in the suburb north of the city. Thought about Dana, who was a single parent and had worked here for 6 years and had a student loan balance she'd mentioned once and never mentioned again. Everyone in this building is in a position he can pressure, she said. He runs the department. Not for much longer, Drummond said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of what he intended to make true. I need you to do something for me. Not for the investigation, for the patient side of this. She waited. The 11 cases Briggs identified. I need someone to go through them and flag anywhere a patient might currently be experiencing ongoing harm, medical harm, complications that weren't properly treated because the documentation was falsified. He looked at her. Not for the investigation, for the patients. She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been thinking about the cases as documentation, as evidence of a pattern, as proof of what Hale had done. She hadn't thought about the fact that some of those 11 people might still be dealing with what had happened to them without knowing the real cause. I'll need system access, she said. Briggs can get you limited read access through the federal inquiry scope. It's not your credentials, it's inquiry access, documented and authorized. He paused. Can you do it? Yes? Then do that first, he said. Before anything else. She nodded and turned to leave. She was in the doorway when he said her name. She turned back. The medication order, he said. The one they used to suspend you. Whose credentials were used to enter it? Mine. Someone used my login. From which terminal? She'd been so focused on the timestamp discrepancy, on when the order was entered relative to when she'd left the building, that she hadn't pulled the terminal ID. I don't know. Find out, he said. The terminal location tells you where in the building the person was when they entered it. That might be more specific than the timestamp alone. She stood in the doorway and felt the specific sensation of a thing clicking into a shape she hadn't seen before. The timestamp proved she was out of the building. The terminal ID would prove where inside the building the person had been. If the terminal was in a location with a camera or a card access log or any other record of who was in that space at 11:47 p.m. Okay, she said. She went back to find Briggs. The terminal ID came back at 10:31, embedded in the EMR audit log that the forensic imaging had pulled from the server before the preservation order locked everything down for formal processing. The medication order had been entered from Terminal 4 North 7. She looked at the location code and cross-referenced it with the hospital's floor map, which Briggs had on her tablet. Terminal 4 North 7 was the physician workstation in the 4th floor surgical prep corridor, a space used primarily by surgical attendings and senior residents before and after procedures. A space that would be logged by the keycard reader on the corridor access door, which required attending-level credentials to enter after 10 p.m. A space that Marcus Hale used every time he had an evening surgical case. She sat with that for a moment. The keycard log for that corridor, for the night of the order, would show exactly who had accessed the surgical prep corridor between 11 p.m. and midnight. If Hale's card had been used, or if any other identifiable card had been used, they would have a direct line from the falsified medication order to a specific person in a specific location at a specific time. The keycard log for 4 North, she said to Briggs. Is that in scope for the forensic pull? Briggs checked. Physical access logs are held separately from the EMR. They're managed by the security system. She paused, typing. But physical access systems fall under the preservation order if they're relevant to the inquiry. We can request them. Request them. It'll take a few hours to process. Then start it now. Briggs started it. Leah sat back in the chair and looked at the whiteboard with its faded budget review Q4 and thought about 8 months. About Earl Briggs in Bay 4 and the troponin flag and the smile that hadn't reached Hale's eyes. About the specific loneliness of knowing something was wrong and not having anyone with the authority to care. She thought about Ruth Okafor, who'd filed a complaint 14 months ago. She opened Voss's phone and typed a message to Briggs's number. Ruth Okafor, former patient advocate, Crestfall, terminated approximately 13 months ago. Can Mercer add her to the inquiry contact list as potential additional witness? Briggs's response came in under a minute. Already on the list. Mercer's office contacted her at 8 a.m. She's been waiting 14 months for this call. She set the phone down. At 11:15 a.m., Marcus Hale requested an emergency meeting with the hospital's board of directors. She knew this because Voss was monitoring the hospital's internal communication system under the inquiry scope, and the meeting request came through the administrative email system at 11:17 and generated a flurry of response activity in the chain that Briggs flagged and forwarded to Leah's screen in conference room B. The meeting request was framed as an urgent patient safety matter. Hale had titled it, Addressing External Interference in Clinical Operations. He's going to the board, she said to Voss. He's trying to get ahead of the formal notification, Voss said. If he can brief the board before Mercer's office sends the official inquiry notice, he controls what they hear first. Can he still do that, after everything this morning? The board doesn't know what happened this morning. They know a military unit is on site with a classified patient. They may know there's an inquiry, but they don't know the scope. Voss looked at her. He's going to tell them it's targeted harassment of a physician by a disgruntled former employee who's manipulated military personnel into acting as her personal enforcement unit. She thought about how that would sound to a board of directors who had spent years being presented with Marcus Hale's quality metrics and publication record, and the departmental revenue numbers that a Level 1 trauma center needed to function. We need to notify the board through official channels first, she said. Mercer's office is preparing the formal notice now, but official channels move at official pace. How long? 2, maybe 3 hours before the notice reaches the board secretary through the proper process. Hale's meeting is in 45 minutes. Voss said nothing, which was its own answer. She looked at the materials on the table, at the 11 cases, at the summary document and the audit log excerpts, and the photograph of the contract that had started all of it, at the terminal ID printout and the keycard request and the portable hard drive enclosure that was currently being forensically imaged in the security office down the hall. I need to be in that board meeting, she said. You have no standing with the board. I have the documentation, and I have something Hale doesn't have, which is that everything I've given this inquiry is true, and when the board gets the official notice in 3 hours, everything I say in that room is going to be verifiable. She looked at Voss. He's going to walk in there and tell them a story. I need to be there to tell them a different one. Not argument, just the documents, just the timeline. Let them look at both and decide which one requires a federal inquiry to exist. Voss studied her for a long moment. The board has the authority to suspend a physician's hospital privileges, he said, pending investigation, without waiting for the licensing board or the federal process to conclude. I know. That's a faster outcome than anything Mercer can produce in the next 48 hours. I know, she said again. He looked at his watch. The boardroom is on the 6th floor. Meetings at noon. He paused. I'll have Briggs prepare a documentation packet. Hard copies. Boards respond better to paper than screens. He stood up. And I'm coming with you. You don't have to. I have a patient in the ICU whose care is directly affected by the outcome of this meeting, he said. I have every reason to be there. The boardroom on the 6th floor was different from the rest of the hospital in the specific way that the spaces where money talked were always different. Better furniture, better light, a long table that had been replaced sometime in the last decade and not the decade before that. There were 8 board members, and they were all present when Leah and Voss walked in at 2 minutes to noon, which meant Hale's people had already made sure the meeting had good attendance. Hale was standing near the window on the far side of the room. He saw her the moment she walked in, and this time he didn't control the reaction quickly enough. She watched surprise become something harder and less managed for about 2 full seconds before the mask came back. 2 seconds wasn't much. It was enough. The board chair was a woman named Dr. Sylvia Park, whose background was hospital administration rather than clinical medicine, and who looked at Leah and Voss with the measured expression of someone who was going to let this situation develop before she decided what it meant. This meeting was called by Dr. Hale, Park said. It was not an open session. Voss said, I'm Captain Marcus Voss, 3rd Medical Support, currently managing a federal inquiry that directly involves the clinical operations of this hospital. I have a formal interest in any board discussion of that inquiry. He set a documentation packet on the table. Briggs had assembled it in 23 minutes, 15 pages, tabbed and dated. I'd ask for 5 minutes before Dr. Hale begins. Park looked at Hale. Hale's expression was controlled. He said, "The captain can observe. This won't take long." Park nodded. 5 minutes, Captain." Voss didn't take 5 minutes. He took 3. I was precise, sequential, and completely without drama. The cases, the timestamps, the billing differentials, the falsified medication order, and the terminal ID and the keycard request pending on the access log. He didn't editorialize. He stated facts and cited the document page for each one and moved to the next fact. It was the most effective 3 minutes she had ever watched anyone spend in a conference room, and she'd spent a lot of time in conference rooms over the last 8 months. When he finished, he stepped back. The room was quiet. Hale said, "What you're describing is a preliminary inquiry based on documentation assembled by a suspended employee with a demonstrated grievance against this department. None of it has been adjudicated. None of it constitutes a finding." "Correct," Voss said. "The formal findings will come from Agent Mercer's office, which will be issuing the official board notification this afternoon. This is not a presentation of findings. This is context. Context designed to prejudice this board. The board can look at the documents and decide what they think," Voss said. "That's literally the function of a board." Hale turned to Park. "Sylvia, this is a military officer who flew in this morning with a classified patient and has spent the last 6 hours building a case against the physician who treated that patient. I want someone to think carefully about what's actually happening here." Park looked at the documentation packet on the table. Then she looked at Leah. "Ms. Donovan," she said, "you were placed on suspension 2 days ago." "Yes." "And you're here because the medication order used to suspend me was entered at 11:47 p.m. from a terminal in the surgical prep corridor on the 4th floor. I left this building at 10:15 p.m. My badge scan is in the security log." She kept her voice level. "I'm here because 11 patient cases show documented anomalies that are currently under federal review. I'm here because a patient advocate named Ruth Okafor filed a complaint 14 months ago and lost her job. I'm here because the person who called this meeting knew that official notification from the Inspector General's office was 3 hours away and wanted to talk to this board before that notification arrived." She paused. "I'm not asking this board to make a final determination. I'm asking you to wait 3 hours before you make any decision, because the official documentation will tell you everything you need." The room was quiet again. Hale said, "I want her removed from this room." Nobody moved. Park looked at the documentation packet. She picked it up and opened it to the first tab, the timeline, which Briggs had laid out in a single clean page, and read it. She read the whole thing. Nobody spoke while she did. When she set it down, she looked at Hale with an expression that Leah couldn't fully read but could feel, the particular quality of a decision being made in real time by someone who was going to live with it. "Marcus," Park said, "I'm going to recommend that the board vote today to place your clinical privileges on administrative hold, pending the outcome of the federal inquiry." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Leah had heard all morning. Hale stared at Park. "Sylvia, you don't have the authority. The bylaws are clear on temporary privilege suspension during an active external investigation. I've read them. I imagine your legal counsel has too, though I understand he's not available this afternoon." She looked at the other board members. "I'd like a motion." One of the board members, a man in his 60s at the far end of the table who'd been still and watchful throughout, said, "So moved." "Second," said a woman to Park's left. Hale took a step forward. His voice came out with the first real fracture in its composure that she'd heard all morning. Not loud, not broken, but a hairline crack in the controlled surface that had held through the trauma bay and the hallway and the department meeting and the boardroom right up until this moment. "This is being done on the basis of unverified documentation assembled by someone who was suspended for a patient safety violation. The motion is made and seconded," Park said. "All in favor." 6 hands went up. Hale looked around the room. At the 6 hands. At Park. At Voss, who was standing at the side of the room with the documentation packet closed in front of him and the expression of someone watching a thing conclude the way he'd expected it to. And then he looked at Leah. She'd thought about this moment. Not this specific moment. She hadn't known it would be a boardroom at noon, but the general shape of it. The moment he would have to look at her and understand that the thing he'd built, the layered protection and the managed reputation and the careful architecture of a career that looked impenetrable from the outside, had come apart because a nurse he'd treated like furniture had been paying attention. She looked back at him without triumph and without apology and without the anger that had been sitting in her chest for 8 months, because the anger had done its job. It had kept her moving when she could have stopped, and she didn't need it anymore. He looked away first. "The motion carries," Park said. "Dr. Hale, your clinical privileges at Crestfall Memorial Hospital are hereby suspended pending conclusion of the federal inquiry. You are to have no contact with patient records or clinical systems as of this moment. HR will contact you regarding the formal process." She looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, but was not without it. The expression of a person who had respected someone and now had to hold both that history and this present simultaneously. "I'm sorry it's come to this." Hale didn't say anything. He picked up the folder he'd brought to the meeting. He walked to the door. He opened it, and then he stopped. She saw it happen. The pause, the quarter turn, the specific quality of a person who has thought of something at the moment of exit. A person who, for all his faults, had not gotten where he was without being intelligent enough to be dangerous even in retreat. He said, without turning fully, "The audit log you pulled from the server this morning, the inquiry imaging." Nobody answered. "The terminal ID for the medication order," he said, 4 North 7. "Did you run the log for the 2 hours before the order was entered?" She felt something go still in her. "Because if you did," he said, "you'd see that your credentials were in the system starting at 9:52 p.m., not 11:47. You were logged into Terminal 4 North 7 for nearly 2 hours." He turned just enough to be visible in profile. Not entering orders, not doing anything visible in the record, just logged in and idle. He paused. "Which means either someone was sitting at that terminal for 2 hours waiting to use your credentials, or, and I'd like the inquiry to examine this carefully, you logged in yourself, left the session open when you left the building, and someone else used the already open session without your knowledge." He looked at the board. The question of who used the credentials is still valid, but the question of how they got into the session, that leads somewhere your investigation hasn't looked yet. He walked out. The door closed behind him. She stood in the boardroom and felt every person in it looking at her and processed what he'd just said. He was right that she sometimes left sessions open. It was a habit she'd been corrected for, an efficiency shortcut she took during busy shifts when moving between terminals. She hadn't done it intentionally that night, but she couldn't say with certainty that she hadn't done it at all. If the log showed her credentials active from 9:52 p.m., it complicated the clean version. It didn't change the terminal ID, it didn't change the fact that she'd been physically out of the building, but it meant that whoever had entered the order hadn't needed to break into her account. They'd needed only to find the terminal she'd been using and wait, which meant someone had known her habits, someone who worked alongside her, someone who had been in the building that night and knew which terminal she'd been using and had waited until she was gone. She thought about who had known. She thought about Dana, who'd been on shift that night. She thought about the charge nurse who knew her workflow. She thought about the specific and terrible possibility that the person who'd set her up wasn't someone with administrative access and system privileges. It was someone who'd just been paying attention. The same way she'd been paying attention. Voss was beside her. "Did you leave a session open that night?" he said quietly. She looked at the closed door where Hale had just walked out. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think so, but I don't know for certain." "Then we need the full terminal log," he said. "Everything. Who was in that corridor from 9 p.m. to midnight?" "The keycard log," she said. "We already requested it." "We requested it for the period around 11:47. We need to expand the window." He looked at her. "And we need to know who was on that floor between 9 and 10 p.m. She looked at the board members who were still in the room, some of them looking at the documentation packet, and some of them looking at the door, and one of them, the man who'd made the motion, looking at her with an expression that was not doubting exactly, but was waiting. She understood what Hale had done. The board had voted. His privileges were suspended. But he'd left a seat in the room. A question that, if it grew, could reframe everything. Not just about the medication order, about her. About whether she was a person who paid attention, or a person who knew where to look because she'd already been there. She looked at Voss and felt the thing she'd hoped was over opening back up. "The keycard log," she said. "How fast can we get it?" It was already requested, but if Aldis managed any part of the security system administration before he left, he didn't get to the server room. "He didn't need to," Voss said. Physical access logs are a separate system, different administrator. And if the secondary protocol wasn't the data transfer, she finished the sentence in her head before he got there. If the second protocol was the keycard log, and if Aldous had managed to alter or delete the access record for the fourth floor surgical corridor before he left the building at 9:38 a.m., the record that would show who was in that corridor between 9 p.m. and midnight would be gone. And without it, the terminal log showing her credentials active from 9:52 p.m. was the only version of events that remained. Voss was already on the phone before they made it to the elevator. She heard him talking to Briggs in the clipped, information-dense shorthand of someone who had run enough operations to know that the difference between a recoverable situation and an unrecoverable one was usually measured in minutes rather than hours. She stood beside him in the hallway outside the boardroom and listened to half the conversation and filled in the other half from context. And what she understood was this. The keycard log request had been submitted to the hospital security system administrator at 10:47 a.m. The security system administrator was a contracted position, not a hospital employee. The contractor's on-site representative had not responded to the request. The contractor's main office, when Briggs called, said their on-site representative was not currently reachable. "Name," Voss said into the phone. He listened. His expression didn't change. Cross-referenced that against the vendor list on the defense contractor account. He listened again. Then he said, "Get Mercer on the line right now." He looked at Leah while he waited for the transfer. "The security system contractor," he said. "The company that manages physical access logs for this building. They're on the approved vendor list for the same defense medical contractor that ran Hale's consulting payments." She stood very still. It wasn't coincidence. She knew it wasn't coincidence, and Voss knew it wasn't coincidence, and what it told her was that the architecture of what Hale had built was larger and older and more deliberately constructed than even the 11 cases and the billing scheme had suggested. He hadn't just falsified records and covered up mistakes. He had, over years and probably with help, built a small ecosystem of connected relationships that made him difficult to reach from any direction. The contractor who managed the physical access logs was tied to the contractor who ran his consulting payments. Aldous had walked out the door with inside knowledge of what the inquiry had. The IT technician had shown up with a portable drive to move data at 9:30 in the morning. Not improvised, not reactive, prepared. She thought about the email again. The second protocol. She'd assumed it meant one thing. It hadn't meant one thing. It meant several things, running in parallel, because a man who had been doing this for years and had never been seriously threatened before had contingencies she hadn't fully mapped. But she was still standing in this hallway, and Mercer's office was on the phone. What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that could be described as going according to plan, because there was no single plan. There were competing pressures moving at different speeds, and what mattered was which ones landed first. Mercer issued an emergency subpoena for the physical access logs through the federal court system at 11:58 a.m., 6 minutes after Voss reached her. The subpoena required the contractor to produce all records for the fourth floor surgical prep corridor for the previous 72 hours in their unaltered form, with a destruction prohibition that carried criminal penalties. The subpoena was served electronically to the contractor's registered legal address at 12:03 p.m. At 12:09 p.m., the contractor's on-site representative, a man named Paul Eskew, who had been, it turned out, sitting in his car in the hospital parking structure for the last 2 hours not answering his phone, received a call from his company's legal counsel telling him to stop whatever he was doing and cooperate fully with the federal request. Eskew had not yet done anything to the logs. He had been waiting for a second confirmation from whoever had given him the initial instruction, and that confirmation had never come, because the person who was supposed to send it had been in a board meeting watching his hospital privileges get suspended and had not had a free moment to manage his secondary protocol. The access logs were intact. Briggs had them at 12:34 p.m., and she called Leah with the result 22 minutes after that, while Leah was sitting on a bench outside the ICU doing the thing she'd been putting off all morning, which was letting herself be still for 10 consecutive minutes. 4 North Corridor, Briggs said, the relevant window. Tell me. Your credential badge accessed the corridor at 9:48 p.m. That matches the terminal log. Your session opened at 9:52, consistent with the 4 minutes it would take to walk from the badge reader to the workstation. A pause. You badged out of the corridor at 10:09 p.m. And then? The corridor was inactive until 11:31 p.m. Then a second badge access. Different credential. She closed her eyes. Whose? Dr. Raymond Sutter, third-year surgical resident. He badged into the corridor at 11:31 p.m. and badged out at 11:52 p.m. The falsified medication order was entered at 11:47 p.m. Another pause. Dr. Sutter is currently on shift. He's in the building. She opened her eyes. Raymond Sutter. She knew him. Not well, the way you knew residents you'd worked alongside without ever having a real conversation. A young man in his mid-20s who was quiet and competent, and who had spent most of his residency rotating through Hale's surgical service. She'd handed him charts. He'd thanked her without looking up. She hadn't thought about him once during all of this. He was Hale's resident, she said. Primary resident on Hale's service for the last 14 months, Briggs confirmed, including the November case, the February case, all three of the post-op documentation cases you identified. The shape of it settled completely. Not a co-conspirator in the full sense, probably not someone who understood the billing scheme or the contractor relationships. A young resident who'd been told, by the man who controlled his career and his evaluations and his path to board certification, to do one specific thing on one specific night. Maybe told it was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Maybe told that a nurse had caused a problem that needed to be managed. Maybe not told much at all, just given a login and a task and a reason to trust the person asking. She didn't know yet which of those it was. It mattered for Sutter's situation. It didn't change the record. Briggs, she said, can you make sure Voss knows before anyone approaches Sutter? Already done. Voss is pulling him from shift now. Gently. She sat with that word. Gently. Voss, who had walked into a trauma bay at 5 in the morning and moved through a hospital, like someone who understood that walls were mostly a suggestion, being gentle with a third-year surgical resident who had probably spent last night not sleeping, realizing that whatever he'd done for the man who ran his career had just become something a federal investigator would be asking him about. She felt something that was not quite pity. She wasn't ready for that yet, but was adjacent to it. Sutter had been a tool, the same way she'd been a target. Different positions in the same structure. She stood up from the bench and went to check on Drummond. I was sleeping when she looked through the ICU window, which was the best possible news. His BP on the monitor read 108/70. The packed dressing had been checked and reinforced by the surgical resident covering his care. Not Sutter, someone from a different service. And his temperature had come up to 36.2. His body was doing the slow, unglamorous work of stabilizing itself, banking the reserves it was going to need in 18 hours when Solis opened him back up to finish the repair. She watched him sleep for a minute. He looked older than she remembered from Kandahar, which was obvious and also not. 4 years was 4 years, and the work they both did aged a person in the specific ways that stress and insufficient rest and sustained exposure to the worst moments of other people's lives tended to do. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His left hand, resting on the blanket, had a scar she didn't recognize crossing the knuckle of his index finger. She thought about the dust storm, the single unit of blood, the specific quality of focus that took over when everything else fell away, and there was only the problem in front of you and what you knew and what you could do with what you knew. She thought that part of her was finished when she separated from service. She was still thinking about that when the ICU door opened and one of Drummond's soldiers, the one she'd started thinking of as the quiet one, because he'd been in 3 different locations this morning without ever appearing to move, said, "Commander's asking for you." "He's asleep." "He was. He's asking for you now." She went in. Drummond's eyes were open and tracking, which was better than the corridor version and considerably better than the gurney version. He looked at her with the directness he'd always had. No preamble, no softening. "The logs?" he said. "Intact. Sutter badged in at 11:31. Order was entered at 11:47. Briggs has it all." He was quiet for a moment. "How old is he?" 26 maybe, 27. "What did Hale have on him?" "His entire future," she said. "That's usually enough." Drummond looked at the ceiling. "Is it enough for the inquiry, without Sutter's statement?" "For the medication order, yes. The keycard log and the terminal log together put him in the room. Mercer can build the case on the records alone." She paused. "But if Sutter talks, It connects the order to Hale directly. Right now, Hale can still argue Sutter acted without instruction. Will he talk? I don't know. Voss is with him. Drummond nodded. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. You should know something, he said. The contract document, the one we found in transit. The IG inquiry into that contractor has been open for 8 months. Not the same inquiry as Mercer's. A separate one. Federal Financial Crimes Unit. He paused. They'd been looking for the clinical component, the patient harm piece that would let them upgrade the charges from financial fraud to something with teeth. He looked at her. You're the reason they have it. She said nothing. I'm not saying that to make you feel better, he said. I'm saying it because it's accurate and you should have the accurate version. He shifted slightly against the pillow. Ruth Okafor's complaint 14 months ago went into a filing system and didn't go anywhere because there wasn't enough to move on. You gave them enough. She thought about Ruth Okafor, who Mercer had called at 8 a.m. and who had been waiting 14 months for that call. She thought about Terry Ash, who had gone home with incomplete documentation of what had happened to her, and had probably spent the following months wondering why her recovery had been so much harder than they'd told her it would be. She thought about all the things that happened in the spaces between what was documented and what was true. I almost stopped, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. After the meeting with him, when he told me to worry about keeping my job, I almost put it down and let it go. Drummond looked at her. What stopped you? She thought about it honestly. It wasn't one thing. It was Terry Ash's post-op nursing record and the way the numbers hadn't added up, and the specific feeling of knowing something was wrong and being the only person in a position to see it. It was the small particular stubbornness of someone who had been trained to stay on a problem until the problem was resolved. I'm bad at letting things go, she said. He almost smiled. I know. I've seen it work before. Raymond Sutter gave a full statement to Voss at 2:17 p.m. She wasn't in the room for it. She was with Briggs, going through the 11 patient cases the way Drummond had asked her to, looking at each one not as evidence but as a person, a clinical record, a body that had passed through this hospital and left with something unresolved that they might not even know to name. She found 4 cases where the documentation gaps were significant enough that the patients might have ongoing complications being managed incorrectly because the treating physicians they'd seen after discharge had been working from a record that didn't reflect what had actually happened to them. She flagged all 4 for immediate outreach. Briggs passed the flags to Mercer's office, which would coordinate with Crestfall's new interim clinical director. Park had appointed one within an hour of the board vote to contact the patients directly. She was still working through the 5th case when Briggs set down her tablet and said, Sutter confirmed direct instruction from Hale. Verbal, no documentation, but he's giving dates and locations and the specific language Hale used. He also confirmed that Hale told him the nurse had already been planning to falsify records to cover her own mistake and that this was about getting ahead of it. Briggs paused. He believed him, or he told himself he did. She looked at the 5th case on her screen. What happens to Sutter, she said. That's not my determination. He cooperated fully and immediately. That typically factors into the outcome. Briggs looked at her. He's 26 and he made a choice that was wrong. He also made the right choice this afternoon when someone gave him the option. She thought about being 26 and early in a career and having the person who controlled everything you'd worked for tell you to do something and frame it as the reasonable, protective thing. She thought about the choice she'd made 3 days ago, when she'd walked into the workstation and sat down across from Marcus Hale and told him what she'd found, knowing he wasn't going to respond well and doing it anyway. Choices weren't made in clean conditions. That was the thing nobody told you. They were made in corridors and conference rooms and the front seats of cars at 5 in the morning, with incomplete information and a body that was tired and a future that was unclear. And the only thing that distinguished one person from another was what they did in that specific moment of murk. She went back to the 5th case. Marcus Hale was arrested at 4:44 p.m. in the physician parking structure on the east side of the building. He had not left after the board meeting. He'd gone to his office, and for 3 hours he had presumably been talking to attorneys and making calls and doing whatever a person does when they can see the structure they've built beginning to come down and they're still looking for the angle that stops it. She didn't know exactly what those 3 hours looked like for him. She didn't try to imagine it. When federal agents from the Financial Crimes Unit arrived to serve the arrest warrant, a warrant that had been waiting in their system for 6 weeks, pending the clinical component that Mercer's office had formally provided at 1:30 p.m. He walked out of his office without being told twice. She heard this from Briggs, who heard it from Voss, who had been present in the building when it happened. The charges were extensive: federal healthcare fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of medical records. The Financial Crimes Unit had been waiting for the obstruction charge in particular, which the server room incident and the SQ situation had provided with specificity. Warren Aldis was located at his home at 5:12 p.m. and served with a separate but related warrant. The Board of Directors received the formal Inspector General's notification at 3:47 p.m., which was about 4 hours later than it should have been and about 12 hours faster than it would have been without everything that had happened that morning. None of it was clean. Criminal processes never were. There would be attorneys and continuances and the slow grinding machinery of a system that moved at its own pace regardless of what everyone already knew. Hale would be out on bond by morning. The charges would take months, probably longer, to resolve. But the privileges were suspended. The patients were being contacted. The records were sealed. The structure was down. She was in the hospital cafeteria when she heard about the arrest, eating the first real meal she'd had since the previous day. A sandwich from the hot case that was mediocre in a way she found actively comforting. The specific solidity of ordinary food after an extraordinary day. And she sat with the news for a moment and felt the complicated thing that came after a long effort concludes. Not exactly relief. Not happiness. Something more like the quiet at the end of a very long run, when the legs stop and the breathing slowly normalizes, and the body has a moment to register what it just did. Gail found her there at 5:40. She sat down across from Leah without asking, the way people did when they'd made a decision and were carrying it as a physical fact in their body. She looked like someone who had gotten through a difficult day and was not entirely sure what the next one was going to look like. "The charge nurse is saying you're going to be reinstated," Gail said. "I don't know that yet." Park said it in the all-staff email 20 minutes ago. "Pending formal review with expectation of resolution," which in board language means yes. Gail looked at her. "Are you going to come back?" Leah looked at her sandwich. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. Coming back to the department, to the unit, to the work of restocking supplies and handling the hard patients and translating for the family in Bay 7. She'd been so focused on what needed to stop that she hadn't thought carefully about what came after. "I don't know," she said. It was true. "Do you think I should?" Gail considered that seriously, which she appreciated. "I think the department needs people who pay attention," she said. "I think we don't have enough of them, and I think most of us spent 8 months pretending we didn't notice things that we noticed." She paused. "That's on us, not you." It was more honest than she'd expected, and she didn't have a clean response to it, so she just nodded. Gail stood up. "The Ash statement," she said, "to Briggs this morning. I should have done that 14 months ago. I knew something was off in that post-op record." She picked up her bag. "I told myself it wasn't my place." She left before Leah could answer, which was probably the right move. The second surgery on Drummond lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. Solis did the repair with a vascular surgeon named Dr. Park. Different Park, coincidental, running the mesenteric reconstruction. Leah wasn't in the OR. She was in the waiting area outside the surgical suite, not because anyone had asked her to be there, but because she'd been in this building since 5 in the morning, and she wasn't going to leave until she knew he was through it. Voss sat with her for part of it. They didn't talk much. There wasn't a lot left to say that hadn't been said in the version where things were still uncertain, and in the version where they were less uncertain, silence was functional. At one point he said, "Mercer wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on the case preparation, patient harm documentation, clinical record interpretation, paid federal contract work." She looked at him. "Is that a real question, or are you softening something?" "It's a real question." She thought about it. About sitting across a table from case files and finding the places where what was documented diverged from what was true. About the work of paying attention, which she was apparently bad at stopping. "Tell Mercer I'll think about it," she said. "That's what I told her you'd say." Drummond came out of surgery at 10:58 p.m. Solis found her in the waiting area and said the repair had gone well, which was surgeon language for better than expected, and that barring complication he would be looking at a week of inpatient recovery before transport to a military medical facility. He said it with the specific quality of a man who had spent a long day doing difficult work and was honestly reporting the results. And she thanked him and meant it. She stayed until Drummond was settled in recovery and the monitors were stable, and the night shift ICU nurse, a competent, unhurried woman named Grace, who had been briefed on the case and asked exactly the right questions, had taken over his care. She looked at him through the recovery room window. He was under anesthesia, the repair done, the biology of healing now running its slow and non-negotiable process. He looked, for the first time since the helicopter had landed that morning, like a person who was not in immediate danger. She put her hand briefly on the window, not for any particular reason she could have articulated. Then she took it away and walked to the elevator. The suspension was formally lifted at 9:15 a.m. the following morning in a letter from Park that used the phrase "with apology" for the circumstances that led to its issuance and offered her reinstatement to her previous position. She read the letter at her kitchen table, with coffee that was too hot because she'd forgotten to let it cool, and she thought about Gail's question. Are you going to come back? She'd worked in this field because she believed in the work. Not abstractly, concretely, specifically, the particular value of someone who was trained and present and paying attention in the moments when another person was in real trouble. That hadn't changed. She'd spent 4 years in situations where the margin between a patient surviving and not surviving was often the competence and focus of a single person at a critical moment. And she'd brought that knowledge into a civilian hospital and used it daily in ways that nobody saw because the drama of those moments was invisible when they went right. The hospital that had treated her like furniture hadn't changed the value of the work. It had just hidden it. She wrote back to Park the same morning and said she would return on a conditional basis, pending the appointment of an independent patient safety ombudsman and the implementation of an anonymous reporting protocol that didn't route through the department chief's office. She said she was happy to consult on what that process should look like if the board wanted input from someone who'd needed it and found it missing. Park responded within 2 hours. Yes to both. When can we meet? She answered, next week. I have something to finish first. What she had to finish was the patient outreach documentation, the 4 cases she'd flagged, the people who might be living with unresolved complications from surgeries they'd been told went fine. It took 3 days. She worked from her kitchen table with read-only inquiry access and Briggs available on the phone for questions about documentation format, and she produced 4 clinical summaries that Mercer's office used to coordinate with the interim director on direct patient contact. 2 of the 4 patients had ongoing symptoms that hadn't been connected to the original surgery. One of them had been told by a follow-up physician that her complications were likely stress-related because the surgical record didn't indicate anything that could explain them. She'd spent 7 months believing something was wrong with her, rather than with the record. She found that one hardest to write. She wrote it carefully and without rushing and made sure every relevant detail was documented with the specificity it deserved, because the woman whose name was in that file deserved to have someone pay attention to what had actually happened to her, and this was the form that attention took. She visited Drummond on the 4th day of his recovery, in a different room on a different floor after the ICU step-down. He was sitting up, which was progress, eating something from a hospital tray that he regarded with the resigned tolerance of someone who understood this was part of the process and was doing it anyway. He looked like himself. Not the version from the corridor or the gurney, the version from Kandahar, competent and sardonic and more human in small moments than his professional face generally let on. "You look better," she said. The bar was low. He pushed the tray slightly to the side. "I heard about the reinstatement." "Yeah. Are you going back?" "Conditionally." She sat in the chair by the window. Outside, Meridian was doing the ordinary work of a mid-morning city. Traffic, light, people moving between places. "You?" "I'll be mobile in 3 weeks, Mercer says. Back in rotation in 6. He looked at her. "The consulting offer. From Mercer." "I said I'd think about it." "You should take it." He said it with the directness he used when he wasn't interested in a debate. "Not instead of the nursing. In addition to it. What you did, the way you documented, the way you moved through that system. That's a specific skill, and Mercer's office needs it. And there's no reason you should do only one thing because someone decided the category you were in had limited options." She looked at him. "You spent 8 months letting someone tell you what you were," he said. Don't spend the next 8 doing the same thing in a different direction. She thought about that. About the shape of a life that included the ICU and the kitchen table and the federal case files and the 4 patient summaries and whatever came after those. About the particular kind of strength that wasn't loud, that looked from the outside like patience or endurance or just showing up, but was actually something more intentional than any of those words suggested. She'd never needed to be the loudest person in the room. She'd never needed the title or the recognition or the moment where everyone looked at her and understood. She'd needed the work to mean something. She'd needed the truth to be findable. She'd found it. "I'll think about it," she said again. Drummond shook his head slowly. "You already decided." She didn't argue because he wasn't wrong. 3 months later, the federal case produced its first set of formal charges. Marcus Hale was indicted on 11 counts, including 2 counts of obstruction that carried the most serious sentencing exposure. Warren Aldis entered a cooperation agreement with prosecutors and provided testimony that confirmed the contractor relationship structure and the mechanism by which billing manipulations had been routed. Raymond Sutter's cooperation was formally noted in a prosecutorial memorandum that recommended consideration of his early disclosure in any eventual sentencing proceeding. The State Medical Licensing Board suspended Hale's license pending the federal outcome. The suspension was indefinite. Paul Askew, the security contractor who had sat in his car for 2 hours waiting for a confirmation that never came, lost his contract with the hospital and cooperated with investigators in exchange for a non-prosecution agreement. He was 29 years old and had needed the work and had done something wrong because someone he trusted in a professional context had told him it was fine, and the system processed his situation accordingly, not cleanly, not perfectly, but with the imperfect mechanics of accountability, working more or less the way they were supposed to when the evidence was intact and the record was honest. Ruth Okafor received a formal written apology from Crestfall Memorial Hospital's board of directors and a financial settlement that she declined to disclose publicly. She was also offered her former position, which she declined. She'd taken a job with a patient advocacy nonprofit the previous year, work she described, in the brief conversation she and Leah had over the phone one afternoon, as more honest about what it is. They talked for 20 minutes, 2 people who had noticed the same things from different angles at different times. And Leah felt the particular companionship of that, of knowing someone else had stood in the same space and chosen the same difficult option and paid a version of the same price. They didn't have a lot in common beyond that. They agreed to stay in touch. They meant it. On a Tuesday in early spring, Leah Donovan walked into Crestfall Memorial Hospital's emergency department for the first shift of her reinstated employment, hung her badge on the same hook she'd used for 8 months, and went to work. It was a busy morning. Flu season carrying over into March, 2 MVAs before 8, a pediatric case that required everything she had for 40 minutes, and then resolved, cleanly and completely, because she knew what she was doing and she'd been paying attention. Nobody treated her like furniture. Some of that was the changed administration, the new department head, the independent ombudsman who had started her role the previous week and had already received 2 anonymous clinical concerns that were being formally reviewed. Some of it was Gail, who had apparently talked to people, in the direct and unfussy way Gail did things. Some of it was just the ordinary process of a department reckoning with what it had allowed and trying, imperfectly and inconsistently, to do differently. And some of it was simpler than any of that. Some of it was just that the people who'd spent 8 months not quite seeing her had looked finally and found something worth looking at. During a lull in the afternoon, she stood at the nursing station and looked at the ER around her, at the bays and the monitors and the people moving through the space with the specific purposeful velocity of healthcare work. And she thought about all of it. About the 8 months and the kitchen table and the 5 in the morning and Drummond in a hospital gown with an IV line and everything that came before and after. She thought about what she'd told Dana the night the photograph had come through on Voss's phone. "I'm working on it." That was the whole of it, really. Not a dramatic declaration or a moment of clarity or a perfect decision made with full information. Just a person who noticed something wrong and kept working on it, past the point where stopping would have been easier, past the point where someone told her it was over, past the point where the system she was working against had more power and more structure and more protected ground than she did. Quiet persistence was not glamorous. It didn't look like strength from the outside, not usually. It looked like stubbornness or naivety or someone who didn't know when to let something go. But the records existed because she'd kept looking. The patients were being contacted because she'd kept the notebook. The case was built because she hadn't walked away from the stairwell at 5 in the morning when a photograph arrived on a borrowed phone and the city was dark, and the smart decision would have been to go back to sleep and let someone else handle it. There was no one else. There rarely was. There was just the work and the person willing to do it, and the choice made again and again in the small moments that didn't look like choices at all. To pay attention, to stay honest, to refuse the version of events that was easier, and hold on to the version that was true. She had paid a price for that. She would pay versions of it again in whatever came next, because that was the cost of the kind of person she was, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. She looked at the ER and felt, underneath the tiredness and the residue of the months before, and the ordinary complexity of a life that was still in progress, something that was not exactly peace, but was close enough to function like it. The particular undecorated satisfaction of being exactly where your skills were needed, doing exactly the work you were built for, in a place that had finally, slowly, imperfectly started to see you clearly. Her pager went off. She answered it and went back to work.